Okay, welcome all. Tonight is the Environmental Protection Committee meeting for the Manhattan Community Board 1. Alice Blank, Chair of the committee, Wendy Chapman, co-chair, Diana Sweetside, Director of Planning and Land here at CB1. Thanks for showing up or on the screen. Tonight is a great opportunity. It's an informational meeting, not a public hearing, on the 250 Water Street application. This will consist of Laura Dodge, who is the independent consultant that's working with the community to discuss the 250 Water program, followed by the HHC, the Howard Hughes Corporation team in some order, to talk a little bit about the draft EIS, environmental impact statement. So this is a good night for questions, concerns to be raised, notes to be taken. There will be a lot of follow-up in terms of providing information to Howard Hughes about what the community wants to know and thinks about certain aspects of the application in terms of the EIS. So I also want to make one welcome here to Kenny Grant. Wave there. Delighted to have Kenny, who has joined our committee, and it's giving Ling. Is that? Welcome to Kenny, who is also now joined as a public member of Community Board 1, and I'm delighted to meet you, and thanks so much for coming tonight. Okay, so I think we're going to start with Laura Dodge from Excel Environmental. We'll be talking with you. Just to know, we have asked and a number for extension review plan. There's a belief when all of the closed ability for and something just not enough for today. So DEC has a 3-day extension, and we're looking full extension, which would be to October. It's out for full engagement in our community, which we're and we're working. This meeting, you'll be here already found, and anyone from there, obviously, and address all of our comments and back to us. Welcome. I'm not going to see you because you're here, but ready. Laura, are you with us?
Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
Welcome. Yeah.
Welcome. Okay, you can hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry for the lack of video. I don't know what's going on my end. Seems like it's something all the time. But thanks for having me tonight, and good evening, everyone. So the draft remedial action work plan was issued June 23rd, 2021. And as I'm sure anyone who's gone on to the DC website to look at it has found out, it's a very large document. A lot of the document, though, are attachments. The real heart of the document is in the text of the remedial action work plan and some key attachments like the construction health and safety plan, the community air monitoring plan, documents that contain the means and methods, as well as the proposed scope for the remedial action or the cleanup, also known as a cleanup. So just to give a little bit of a brief background, the remedial investigation, which was conducted basically over the 5 phases of investigation, essentially found impacts to soil at the site that relate to historic fill, which is basically fill material that was impacted before it was used to raise the grade. And that historic fill has various concentrations of metals and some other organic compounds that are very commonly found in urban, what we also see in many times as urban fill. And then superimposed on that, there were basically 2 primary areas of impacts. One was a series of underground storage tanks that historically contained petroleum products, basically in the corner of the property close to Peck Slip and Water Street. And there's indications that those tanks leaked, and so there's petroleum impacts to soil and also some isolated localized impacts to groundwater. And then the larger area of concern, I think that's gotten the majority of attention for good reason, is the historic thermometer factory footprint, lot 302, which is going towards Pearl Street in the central section of the site, going up to the border of the property with Pearl Street, where total concentrations of mercury were found in soil above the soil cleanup objectives for mercury. The unrestricted use standard for mercury is 0.8 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. The restricted use standard is 0.18 is the unrestricted use. 0.81 is the restricted use standard. So the cleanup standard is low by any measure, and the concentrations that were found in the footprint of the former thermometer factory were elevated over that standard. Concentrations as high as 200 or 300, maybe even 400 parts per million were found in certain soil samples, with concentrations decreasing with distance away from the footprint of the lot 302 and also with depth vertically. And there were a lot of soil borings conducted during the RI, and delineation vertically and laterally was essentially completed. There were 2 or 3 locations where vertical delineation wasn't achieved, but those areas are going to be addressed anyway through the remedy that's being proposed. So there were no impacts to groundwater with respect to mercury concentrations. Mercury was not found in groundwater at concentrations actually, I don't think it was found at all above detection limits. What was found in groundwater basically relates to what seems to be going on regionally. There seems to be some chlorinated organics in the groundwater that are showing up. There's no on-site source for those chlorinated organics. There are some other compounds that are sort of background coming onto the site and going off the site at around the same concentration. And then also in soil, there were various metals. There were some detections of PCBs, but these are concentration ranges that fit in the category of this historic fill classification that I first spoke about. Nonetheless, these are concentrations in soil that you don't want to be coming in contact with dermally, and you don't want to be inhaling soils or sediment or dust that might contain these constituents. So essentially, the results from the RI indicate that there are nothing related to mercury impacts in groundwater migrating off-site, because there's really no impacts to groundwater at all. The petroleum impacts are isolated to the immediate vicinity of the underground storage tanks and going up towards the property boundary, and they will need to be addressed. So the underground storage tank area, the mercury impacts to soil, and the site-wide historic fill are the primary conclusions from investigating the site through the RI. So in conducting an initial review of the remedial action, the draft remedial action work plan, the proposed remedy essentially is to address those 3 areas of concern. The underground storage tanks would have to be decommissioned and removed from the ground. Oil or petroleum impacted soil and groundwater would also be removed down to soil cleanup objectives. And then mercury impacted soil would be excavated for offsite disposal down to the depths that are necessary to achieve the restricted use soil cleanup standards, which might wind up even achieving the unrestricted, because the extent of excavation is going to be driven in part by the impacts to soil, but also in part by the necessary depths that the developer has to achieve for the redevelopment. So it's actually a tandem set of goals that the developer has. They have to come in and address the issues of environmental concern, and at the same time manage groundwater that's encountered because they're going to be excavating deeper than the top of the water table. So in doing so, they're going to be generating water that has to be managed. The plan calls for treating that water and then discharging it to the sewer. Depending upon the volume of water, they may need certain types of permits. Those are all mentioned in the plan and would be obtained upon determination that they're going to be necessary, if they are necessary. So the plan itself is goes through the different tracks for the remediation, the remedy. Under the Brownfields Cleanup Program, there are 4 tracks for cleanup. Track 1, 2, 3, and 4. 3 is not addressed in the plan, nor does it need to be, because in track 3, the scope of the remedy is essentially targeting an alternative cleanup standard that you might propose to use, not the published standards. And they're not proposing any alternative cleanup standards. So track 3 is not addressed. Track 1 is a remedy that essentially eliminates any need for any restriction on the site. No need to go and have any kind of engineering control, no residual concentrations in soil remaining above the cleanup standard. That is a remedy that would typically be used in an instance where you're putting single-family homes on a property. It's not common to be using that on a Brownfields Cleanup Program site. The most common track, actually, for Brownfields Cleanup Program sites is track 4, which is a restricted use track where shallow soils that are exposed have to be addressed with a remedy, but you're leaving behind concentrations of soil that are in excess of the cleanup standards because you're using your development as a series of engineering controls, using different surfaces as an engineering cap, for instance. So the alternative that HHC and Langen proposed is actually track 2. And that one is a restricted use, similar to track 4, but it's essentially going beyond what would typically be done in a track 4 remedy. It's removing more soil than typically would be done if they were not needing to go as deep as they are. And if they did not have to address the mercury impacts, which in and of themselves are deep, and they need to go and remove the majority of those elevated concentrations. So the actual proposed plan, which is parts of the remedial action work plan are very detailed. Parts are going to be filled in with more detail once all the comments are received and the agencies approve the plan, because they have to put meat to the bones in certain places within the plan. And that's common and typical. So we're not concerned about that at this stage. But we do know that the proposed plan calls for removing the mercury impacted material to depths of between 4 and 18 feet, depending upon where you are on the site, depending upon the data, as far as the depth of contamination. I'm sorry, between 4 and 16 feet in order to get the mercury impacted material. And they have to over excavate a little bit to allow for safe sloping of the excavation at a 1-to-1 slope. So they're moving a little bit more soil out than they would have otherwise if it wasn't as deep. And then following that, after the underground storage tanks are addressed, the mercury impacted material are removed, then they're going back to remove basically up to 15 feet deep of historic fill across the entire property, essentially corner to corner, curb to curb. And that would give them, anywhere between 10 to 15 feet, depending upon the actual need for the, based on the development. So right now they're at, it's a range of about 15 feet. it's a large amount of soil, about 22,000 cubic yards of material that would be removed for the historic fill portion of the remedy. And what they're going to be doing is, because they're going to be excavating down to below the water table, typically would take post-excavation soil samples, but they're going to be below the water table, and it's not typical to take soil samples below the water table because you're not really getting a representative sample of soil. You're getting water mixed in with your soil. So they will likely, or they talk about in the plan, going out and doing additional delineation in advance of the excavation to establish the depth that they need to achieve and fill in any data gaps that might exist with the lateral distribution of impacted soil in order to know exactly where they need to excavate in advance. So the plan does include what's called a remedial design investigation. And again, that's something that I had actually suggested when Tom Facillo, the community monitor for the Blue School, and I spoke to the agencies after the RI report was issued. We felt that it's completely acceptable and actually a good idea to do additional delineation and get additional information during the remedial design so that you can fill in the data gaps and finalize the details of your remedial action design. So in that phase of work, they will be likely proposing to do soil sampling so that they can characterize the soil before it's excavated and get approval from a waste disposal facility to be able to take that material for disposal. And they'll have that disposal approval in hand before they initiate excavation. That's the best way to approach it, because now you're just excavating and filling a truck. The truck then leaves the site. You don't have to put the soil in a stockpile and then worry about covering that stockpile so it doesn't create dust or have contaminated runoff from a rainfall event. And that's, again, it's better for the management of the contaminated material, and it's overall just a better approach. You're handling the material one time, excavating it and putting it right in a truck. Essentially what we refer to as dig and haul. So you're excavating and hauling it right off site. Now, the design investigation, so the remedial design investigation work plan still has to be prepared. And that's, again, also typical that would be done after all comments are in so that they can make sure that they've addressed any concerns. In that remedial design investigation, we would like to see them also perform a test pit investigation. In the plan currently, there are no real details yet, but it's my understanding that they're considering it. That test pit investigation would essentially take an area that you would open up the asphalt pavement, excavate down, and provide the missing link right now, which is air quality data after the asphalt or a portion of the asphalt is removed, so that you can correlate what you can expect to see when you do a full-scale excavation a lot more accurately than you can just by doing a soil boring, which is what was done during the RI. And during the RI, they did not have any soil vapor issues or air quality issues with mercury, which is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that you can necessarily rest easy that you're not going to see some if you start to do a full-scale excavation. So the test pit investigation will help kind of get a better idea of what you can expect with air quality once the full-scale excavation is initiated. So I would like to see that incorporated into the remedial design investigation, and comments that we'll be putting together to provide to CB1 will include that recommendation. So aside from managing groundwater during the excavation, the real concern is always when you're opening up the ground and excavating contaminated material and handling it on site. Obviously our concern is protection of the public, human health and the environment. We need to be looking very carefully at the best management practices and the engineering controls that will be in place during the performance of this work. the community air monitoring plan that'll be in place during the performance of the work, the health and safety provisions that'll be in place. So in looking at what's been proposed, the action levels for air quality are the same as what was established for the remedial investigation. So we're happy to see that. The 1 microgram per cubic meter action level for mercury, the 5 part per million total VOC action level, and the 100 to 150 for dust and particulates, depending upon where you are. We're also happy to see the community air monitoring plan systems, the same number that was used during the RI. There's 6 altogether, plus 1 in the work zone, plus a dedicated technician to use handheld instruments for real-time monitoring of air quality for mercury vapor, total volatile organics, and particulates between the work zone and the nearest downwind camp. Same approach to monitoring for wind direction, using wind flags, making sure there'll actually be a wind monitor as part of the telemetry system for the camp, the community air monitoring plan. So there's a number of provisions that are in here that are identical to what was used during the remedial investigation work plan. One of my comments is going to be to clarify that a little. In the plan right now, it's a little unclear that dedicated technician is being proposed, but it's my understanding that that is what's going to be done. We just want to see that very clearly stated. Both the agencies and I think Howard Hughes and Langen recognize, the value of having that dedicated technician to ensure that they're monitoring for air quality between the work zone and the nearest downwind camp. The camps will be off-site like they were during the RI when there's work within 20 feet of the property boundary. So it'll be going on during the underground storage tank closure and excavation, during the mercury removal, mercury soil, impacted soil removal, and during the historic fill removal when you're within 20 feet of the property boundary. The camps will be off-site in the downwind direction. You can't have them right on site when you're that close to it. You need to have some buffer. And that's really what worked out very well during the RI implementation. They were able to, move around, follow the wind direction, follow where the activity was going, and ensure that there was no issue, and that that dedicated air monitor is essentially like an early warning system to be able to make sure that nothing actually reaches the offsite camp locations or offsite potential receptors. The other thing, obviously, is best management practices, especially when they're doing the mercury excavation. So the plan does include the type of best management practices that we would like to see, using tarps or plastic to cover open excavation faces, minimizing the number of excavation faces that are exposed at any one time, having Mercon, which is a special foam that suppresses the generation of mercury vapor, and using it during the performance of the work in the event that there's any issue whatsoever with the potential for air quality concerns to emanate from the excavation and reach the property boundary. We don't want to get, the whole idea with the design and the implementation of this is to do everything possible to prevent that from happening. Obviously, we also want to prevent the generation of dust, because we know that not only the mercury impacted soil, but the historic fill contains things that we do not want to be leaving the site in the form of dust, creating a potential inhalation hazard. So there will be the same type of procedures used, but only on a much more robust scale during the excavation, keeping the soils moist, using dust suppression, best management practices. They fall into a whole number of different categories. Misting with water is one, use of water, keeping things wet. Excavating below the water table will help also because the soil will already be wet, but things dry out pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that, dust is kept to a bare minimum on site. They're also including things like tracking pads to ensure trucks aren't tracking soils off the site. they're going to be inspecting tires of trucks before they leave the site. And obviously, these are all things that are done every single day during the entire course of the project, during the active portion of disrupting the subsurface, handling soils, disrupting soils, offloading soils, at all times during when those activities are in progress. So in accordance with DEC requirements for the BCP program, cost estimates were also provided. I have not done a detailed review yet of the cost estimates. I have to still go back and do that. But generally speaking, the cost estimates for track 2 is, obviously more than, it's $11.7 million. The track 1 estimate, which would have been to unrestricted use, which I think would have been very difficult to achieve just based on the thickness and the depth of the historic fill. And not common when you have historic fill curb to curb, especially in an urban area. That estimate was 19 million. And track 4, which is the most common track for a brownfields cleanup program site, was 9.4. So their track 2 costs of 11.7 million are over the 9.4 million for track 4, less than the track 1 of 19 million. So again, the driver for the remediation is in part the necessity to comply with, DEC requirements to address the areas of concern and achieve the restricted use soil cleanup objectives, manage the groundwater, and then redevelop the site, which is driving some of the depths of excavation in historic fill areas. So as a result, once the work is completed in terms of the soil and groundwater active components of the remedy, then they'll come in and the site will be backfilled in some areas to depths that they need it to be backfilled in for the construction, meaning that some areas might be a little deeper because they're going after, let's say, mercury impacted soil at depths that are deeper than they need for the development. And there may be some other areas where that's the case. The underground storage tank area may need to go deeper. That excavation could be up to 16 to 18 feet by the time it's all said and done. So any fill that's brought in will be, appropriate environmentally for use at the site. And then the idea is that the development would then proceed, and the proposed components of the development would then serve as a variety of engineering controls so that there was never any direct contact risk with any residual soils that are left behind, which would essentially fall into the category of historic fill residuals in areas that they aren't going all the way to the base of the historic fill. Those engineering controls would include, the subgrade component of the parking deck or parking garage, which will have a water barrier and a vapor barrier, so that the garage itself, which is the lowest level of the proposed development, will be protected against any vapor intrusion should there be a risk. There will also, I believe, be ventilation associated with that garage so that there wouldn't be an accumulation of any vapor should there even be any detected. They will be doing a soil vapor investigation after the soil remedy is completed and before the development, so that they'll have a better idea of what the potential would be for any generation of vapors of any kind. I would not expect to see mercury because they're doing such an extensive removal of mercury impacted soil, and there is no mercury in groundwater. It's always possible that there'll be a residual volatile organic vapor concern because of the regional impacts with the chlorinated volatile organics, the TC and the PC, which do not appear to be coming from the site. Those might still be there because they're not coming from the site. So there would be a need to verify all that. They may not find anything. It really depends upon, what the net effect of all this remediation is, between the pumping of groundwater, treating of groundwater, discharging it to the sewer, and then, you know, the removal of the soils. Essentially, I mean, I'm sure there's probably components that I didn't directly touch on. I mean, there's a construction health and safety plan, which is designed for the worker protection, but obviously any means and methods being used for protection of workers also ensures that the public is more protected, because they're going to be using controls and monitoring air quality in the work zone. And that's the first line of defense. I mean, just like with the remedial investigation, should they see anything in the work zone, then that information is relayed to the downwind monitor. Downwind monitor gets a heads up, and they may stop work to adjust their engineering controls and their best management practices. That is all reflected in the text of the document. So this is just like with the remedial investigation work plan, this is an iterative process that's actively done every day. I would expect the same type of reporting that was done during the remedial investigation. I'm not sure that the frequency will be the same. This is something that I still have to get into, a detail that I just haven't gotten through yet in preparation for tonight's meeting. I basically got the plan a week before last, and I was out all of last week. So I did my review before last week and then did another review today, but I still have more detail to get through before, you know, we're done with our comments. So, you know, overall, a very comprehensive plan with some details still remaining. We have an opportunity to relay our, you know, comments and things that we'd like to see clarified and to make sure they're crystal clear. The provisions that I just mentioned, though, are addressed, you know, either in discussion generally or in detail, depending upon the component of the plan. I know that was a lot of information, so I don't know. I guess I think that's all I'm going to do for tonight, beyond just answering any questions that anybody might have.
That would be great. Technical moment here where people are having trouble.
Please, I'm going to.
We're doing that. Here, questions go around one. If anybody has questions, let's do it, then we'll.
Call cannot be completed in time.
Great.
And call again.
This is part of the exciting journey of the return to normalcy in all of these moments.
It's not
All right.
Good,
no?
yeah, it should be
Okay.
good.
I'm just gonna just move this,
Okay.
card.
All right, I'm just gonna go around the room, just lift your hand if you've got something, otherwise we'll keep moving on here. So anybody here have a committee or here?
Yeah, Laura, thank you. That was just tremendous. I just have a couple of questions. Some of them are just curiosity questions.
Sure.
First one, if water is being used to keep the dust down, is there any risk in the runoff of that water?
That's a great question. They have to manage that. Usually it's misting, and the reason for using mist is that it doesn't create as much, runoff but that's something that they definitely have to manage and keep it on site. And in my experience, typically the remediation contractor that they use will I'm sure be very skilled in the use of that, especially in the city. But yeah, they definitely want to minimize any runoff from the pile. That's why it's also better not to stockpile soil if they can avoid it, because it's harder to keep rainwater from not creating, runoff. So especially given how small the site is. So I'm hoping, and I think they are also, that they'll be able to get, prior approval for disposal so they don't have to stockpile to the extent possible. But yeah, they're going to have to take care to ensure that there's no runoff generated.
Yeah, one or two more. I didn't really understand the remedial design investigation that led to the dig and haul. How does that actually?
So what happens is the remedial design investigation they're going to be generating a work plan. My understanding is that that HHC and Langen are putting it together now just to get it ready to go. It will include a series of soil borings to collect soil samples not now, but in advance of the start of excavation, so that those samples can be lab tested, and then those results provided to the waste disposal facility. The waste disposal facility has very specific parameters that they look for, not necessarily the same as would be done during the RI. Some of the parameters are different for disposal purposes. So they'll get that information, they'll fill out the applications that go with the waste stream approval, and they'll obtain approval from a variety of different places or from just one or two places, depending upon facilities that can accept the material based on its classification for waste. So that way they'll be able to have, before they start work, they'll be able to have approval to be able to start excavation, fill the trucks, and the trucks can then just go right off site to the disposal facility. And the disposal facilities might be quite a distance away. So it's a good idea to have all this done in advance so that you can plan, because they've got to have the trucks to get the material loaded. And, that's going to be something that has to be managed because, as everybody here knows, there's not a lot of room, and so this is really where the art of it is, and I'm sure that this is something that I'll be looking for in the plan, but it also might be something that's a detail that has to come in a supplemental document. Exactly how they're going to manage the transportation components. I honestly don't know if a lot of detail is in this plan yet, because I wasn't looking for that yet, but I will be looking at it to make sure that there's a good transportation plan.
So does that include investigation of the trucks before they actually leave the site to ensure that the material is secure?
Yes, and I don't want to speak for them now until I look at it, but there are options for the trucks once they're filled. They may be tarped over. I would think that that's very likely. Especially for the mercury impacted material, there'll be tarps that cover the dump trailers or dump trucks, depending upon what type of vehicle they're using. And again, this is a detail that it gets down to the weeds now with exactly how they're proposing it, but because there's different size trucks and I don't know exactly what they're planning yet. But I'll likely have conversations with DEC and DOH that may also include Langen, if that's what the agencies think is a good idea, just so we can talk about some of these details if they're not actually already in the plan.
And my last question is, what's the general time frame for this whole process?
I believe that the schedule indicates about 10 months, if my memory serves me. Didn't look at the schedule today, but I did look at it week before last. So the process for so Appendix I of the Remedial Action Work Plan, for anyone who wants to look through it, is the remediation schedule. And So they have time allocated for the remedial action work plan review and approval and the comment period, which has now been extended by 30 days at least. And then DC issues a decision document once the remedial action work plan is finalized and approved. And then the remedial design investigation has to be conducted. So that phase of work is yet to be developed. So I don't know how long that will take, but if it's field work followed by laboratory analysis, it's going to be several months to complete that, at least a month to 2 months, if not 3 months, depending upon how fast things can get done and how long it takes them to reduce all the data and get all their approvals that they would need for disposal and for other things. Because if they do this sampling in advance to try to get to a predetermined depth of excavation, they're going to need DEC approval in advance before starting work, if that's the way that they decide to go, instead of doing post-excavation sampling. They may do a combination of both. That's very common. So then they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months of remedial action work plan implementation. And then that's followed by a final engineering report and a site management plan, which they have to have for any long-term monitoring of, the engineering controls that are going to be used. So it's the overall project from start to finish, depending upon how long it takes them for the remedial design investigation, could be, a year and a half. From the time, yeah. Yep.
Yes, I just have a follow-up on the trucks. It's common in construction sites around Manhattan for contractors to take over a lane of an adjacent roadway for staging and so forth. Does this plan include the details of the locations that the trucks will be loaded with the the contaminated fill and whatnot that's being taken out? One would hope that would be in the site, not on the adjacent street. It seems to me to be easier to control, dust flying off of these trucks as they're being loaded if it were within the site. Is that detailed?
Another great question. There's a soil management plan that I think is still going to be added to the plan, and because I haven't had tons of time with the document, I don't know yet if there is a specific plan, but I can tell you for sure that we will have input on that. And, we would want them to be loading on site. And that's going to be something that we talk about because as everyone probably realizes, it's one thing to look at these maps and look at the areas of excavation and just go, oh, okay. But it's a small site, so they're going to be restricted depending upon where they're excavating. And that's one of the reasons why, they're doing certain things in a certain order, because, they need to make sure they have access into the site when they're doing the mercury contaminated soil removal. So they want to do that first and get the mercury impacted soil out of the way before they disrupt the rest of the site with the historic fill removal. So they'll have solid ground to stage their trucks as they're excavating. And I would imagine they would do it from inside. And that, I can't imagine anything other than that. But that's a discussion that we will be having with them, with the agencies and probably with Langen when we get into the logistical details. Because logistics on a site like this, and given its location and given its size and orientation, is a really key aspect of this. So very, very good question. And we will definitely be digging into that. No pun intended. That was terrible.
Thank you.
Michael?
All right, my first question is, obviously there's significant public interest in this project. May we request a meeting, the DEC hold a public meeting on this, and shouldn't that public meeting be in September after the school community comes back?
The citizen participation plan, which is part of the BCP program for this site, which was revised in April of 2020 after the RIWP was approved, calls for, I'll read it right out to you. It's page 7 of the Citizen Participation Plan, which is on the DEC website if anyone hasn't seen it. Also referred to as a community participation plan. What it says is, before DEC approves the remedial action work plan, they issue the fact sheet, which they've already done. They announce the 45-day public comment period, which they've already done. Per the request for an extension, they granted a 30-day extension. Public meeting by DEC about the proposed remedial action work plan, if requested by the affected community or at the discretion of DEC project manager. So if at the request of the affected community, DEC's a public meeting is requested, then it should be held within the comment period, not at the end of it, within it. Because you still want the public to be able to provide comments to the DEC like they did when the RIWP was presented at, I believe at the CB1 EPC meeting. Mike Komorowski from DEC, I believe, did a presentation on the draft RI work plan. So yes, the community participation plan or citizens participation plan states that before DEC approves the plan, the public meeting would be held within the comment period.
The point being that this is another reason to extend the comment into September through October the 10th, I think is what we're asking for. My second question has to do with the significant threat determination.
Yes.
Obviously, it's next to schools and everything else. Should DEC and DOH reconsider and reverse this determination?
The significant threat determination was based upon the risk assessment that was done, the Focus Human Health Risk Assessment, which indicated and concluded that under current conditions at the site as it stands right now, there's no complete pathway from any hazard identified at the site to any receptor. During construction and during remediation, followed by construction, I should say, there will be a change in that because there will obviously be a potential for there to be a completed pathway, i.e. somebody could be exposed through dermal contact, someone could be exposed through inhalation. But the remedial action work plan during that transitional period has to include all of these best management practices, the health and safety plan, the community air monitoring plan, the soils management plan, to ensure that that pathway is never completed. So because that is the way the significant threat determination is made, under current conditions, there is no significant threat. Under remediation conditions, as long as this remedial action work plan has the appropriate methods and means, the appropriate scope, the appropriate safety provisions, air monitoring provisions, best management practices, engineering controls during the remediation, then there would be no basis for a significant threat determination.
One of the legally required factors is the proximity of the site to residents, recreational facilities, public buildings, or school facilities, etc. So I think that you should reconsider and reverse that threat determination. My next question is about the mercury contamination that's under Pearl Street. And I understand that it really stops at the sidewalks and somebody else takes over under the public roads. Can you speak about that a little further?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your last bit because it got cut off?
The question about the mercury contamination extending out into Pearl Street beyond the sidewalk.
Yep.
And how is the remediation coordinated with two different actors?
So Howard Hughes Corporation, as a volunteer under the BCP program, is not responsible for contamination beyond the property boundaries unless it migrated from the site. With the case of Pearl Street, there was no migration of the impacts. The road orientation was altered. after the historic use of the site as a thermometer factory and ancillary buildings. So any impacts in Pearl Street which have been identified are currently, under current conditions, capped by the roadway, and that's something that has to still be discussed with DEC. We've had some preliminary discussions about it. It's not a focal point of the remedy that's right in front of us, but I think that there needs to be something done to ensure that in the event that anything ever has to happen in Pearl Street, and that's one of those situations which it could be even in an emergency situation like a water main break or something like that, or utility work, there needs to be recognition that this material remains there, and I think there needs to be a discussion about it. It would not be Howard Hughes's responsibility, though, because it is not contamination that migrated from the site. And as a volunteer under the BCP program, volunteers are not required to go chasing that. And the development is not going to disrupt it. So it's something that needs to be discussed. Absolutely. It's definitely on my radar screen. It's high up there, and it's going to be something that we do bring up in our dialogue with the agencies.
It's of great concern to Southbridge, and obviously utility crews are opening up the street all the time, and they shouldn't be exposed to this. And then my other question is about the school calendar. It would be best if this was 1 year, 1 calendar year of a school calendar rather than extending into 2 calendar years of a school calendar. Therefore, would it make more sense that this should start in July rather than January?
Well, when we talk, you mean the remedial, so what's starting sooner than later would be the investigation, the design investigation, the remedial design investigation field work. So likely that would be the soil borings like they just did for the remedial investigation, and then also test pits, which I would like to see more than one, but at least test pits done that would be representative of the mercury impacted area. So that work, historically, the investigation work was done when school was not in session. That's a discussion we still have to have, because they're right now, they still have to develop, and they are in the middle of developing the remedial design investigation work plan. That work plan will have the scope of work that they're proposing to do, and it'll have, therefore, a better idea of the timing of when that would be done. So yes, we have to have this discussion. There's, as I said, this falls into the category of logistics and planning, and how this is going to get done and when it would get done is really right now something to still be determined, because the
And this is another reason to have a public meeting and to involve the school community as well when they're here, rather than putting it out to the last day of the school year and extending it into the month of August when no one is around. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Anybody else in the community have any comments or questions?
Is there now, or will there be a more in-depth written out plan for possible air contamination or possible proximity impacts?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part. It was muffled.
Like, is there a plan now that's more in-depth that's written out as far as seeing in the future of the possible contamination of the air or vapor?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I mean, the plan that's been provided right now has sufficient detail to ensure that air quality monitoring is being conducted at a frequency and in a manner that's appropriate. Action levels are established, the same ones that were used for the RI work plan. The camp station number, the type of instrumentation, the same approach that was used for the remedial investigation is being proposed for use here. It will be obviously implemented slightly differently because it's a much more robust field activity. So there's going to be, a lot more, activity at the site. So it's going to be a very active site, and there's going to be a lot of activity. It's not going to stop and start as much as the remedial investigation stopped and started. It's going to go on in a more continuous basis for a longer period of time. So there are still a few details, like I said, missing that need to be filled in, which they will be doing that in terms of the supplemental plan. But the air quality piece, I think, is already detailed enough for me to be able to comment on it, and you know, we will be doing that just to ensure that we are interpreting the plan accurately. I'd like to see a little bit of clarification, because initially when I reviewed it, I thought there were certain things that were not in there. When I went back and reviewed it again, and spoke to DEC and DOH, not DOH, I'm sorry, just DEC, there are components that are in there that are just not super clear. So, you know, we're going to make sure that they are clarified. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I hope I did.
To some degree, I guess I just want to know, is there a plan in place if these numbers change and the community is impacted by like vapor that they didn't plan for?
Oh, you're talking about like an emergency response plan.
Just in general, like the numbers might change once they start excavating.
Right. Well, I think the approach, well, first off, the remedial design investigation partly is going to be used to try to get a better idea of what to expect when the asphalt's removed and soils are excavated. So that's number one. That I absolutely want to see as part of the remedial design investigation, and you know, I think that will be something that will be incorporated. I feel very strongly that that's necessary. Right now, there's no details on this yet because the remedial design investigation work plan is not yet ready. So I don't, you know, we'll be looking for that, but we'll be commenting on it as part of our written comments on the draft RAWP. And then as the air monitoring proceeds, there are already provisions in place to react in the event that there's any indication of an increase in air quality concentrations, mercury, total volatile organics, dust. So there's actions that would be taken as soon as there's an indication that those action levels are being reached. Work shuts down, best management practices are applied, depending upon the nature of the issue, whether it be use of Mercon foam to suppress any mercury vapor generation, use of misting in the case of dust or any other odor issue. So there are best management practices incorporated into the plan already, and those would be implemented. So any indication, and that's why the downwind monitor, the technician that would be monitoring in real time with handheld instruments, including the Jerome mercury vapor analyzer and the volatile organic meters and the dust, you know, dust particulate meters, that individual will be dedicated to that between the work zone and the downwind camp. So before it would ever get to be an issue, they'll have information to be able to act. And that's what's so important in terms of the ability to act quickly and have like an early warning that they need to act. So that is, we're going to comment on that to make sure it's crystal clear that the plan has the downwind monitor, that dedicated technician, as they did during the RI. In my understanding that is the intention, it's just not super clear. And then the rest of the plan just gets adhered to. And it's the responsibility, you know, of the contractor and the overseeing consultant, you know, Langen, and the engineers, which would be Langen and, you know, Howard Hughes, to ensure that these components are implemented.
Thanks. We're at an hour now, so I just want to give everybody sort of a sense of that. Is there anybody else on the committee who has a question? And I just ask as we go forward that questions are repeated as much as possible. Wendy, Jeff, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So do you know when you hit the water table, you know, because you're digging 16 feet deep, is the water table, you know, is it at 8 feet? Is it at 16 feet? Like how deep is, I mean, I guess it depends on the tides, I'm not sure, or how much water we've had.
Right. It depends on the location at the site. It actually varies quite a lot. And you kind of nailed the numbers, like between 8 12, 14 feet, depending on where you are. And so they are going to be excavating in certain areas below the water table. And so they're going to be, sorry?
So I was going to say, so how did they do that? Because that was one of the things when we were learning about how they built the bathtub and the World Trade Center site, that was a big thing to, basically hold the river back. That bathtub in the slurry wall is an engineering marvel, and obviously this is a much smaller site than the World Trade Center is, and you don't have the PATH trains coming in and everything else. I understand it's a lot less complicated, but I just keep thinking, like, when you're a child and you go to the beach and you dig a sand castle and you hit the water, the sides keep falling in. And, so how does that work to get a clean edge to the edge of the sidewalk without getting it, falling in? I just am like a child. I think of like that the sides would just fall in. Is that something you've got, pumps and, beams and slurry walls that all get built at the same time? Like, I am not an engineer, but to me that seems really tricky when you're talking about like what's under the sidewalk versus not.
Right. No, I think there needs to be extreme care taken, and I think the approach is going to be, open excavation, recovery of water is my assumption, just based upon the amount of debris that's down there. Actually, the debris is one of the comments I'm going to have on the plan is, and I haven't completed my review yet because, my review is still in process, or in progress. But there needs to be a means of managing debris that's encountered as well. So the one thing about open excavations, they're not going nearly as deep as the World Trade Center, obviously, but going down to depths of, 10, 15, 18 feet, it can be a little tricky. The soils here are very variable. The site's been undisturbed for a long time. They are allowing, that extra area for the 1-to-1 side slope for the side walls of the excavation, meaning for every foot they go down, they have to go over a foot. So they've got this area where they're creating a stable side slope to prevent the excavation from caving in. So this 1-to-1 slope is, designed to ensure or to not have the situation that you just described where you have these vertical sidewalls and it can get undermined at the top of the water table or below the water table, because that's typically where you'll see it start to lose stability, is in the saturated zone. So they're going to be pulling the water table down as they go, so that they, and there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, they want to remove impacted groundwater, especially in the underground storage tank area. And removing the water from the excavation is a very effective way of getting rid of that mass of contamination. And you're giving yourself the ability to see what you're doing by lowering the water table. When you open the ground, the water table automatically drops because you're removing the saturated soil that was in that space. So by doing that, you're removing that mass of soil. The water table automatically is going to be lower and it will drop down just on its own. So it depends upon, again, every site is different. And because of the debris, that's going to be something that is going to come into play, because they have to remove debris and they have to manage the debris. And I haven't gotten through the details of that. There needs to be discussion about how do you manage the debris that you encounter, especially if they encounter debris in the footprint of the mercury impacted material, because there are still remnant foundations down there. We know from the geophysical survey that there are remnants of walls and possibly footings and possibly, even, portions of foundations. I mean, we know that there's wood, and they're going to have to manage that as they go. So, I don't want to oversimplify it. It takes a lot of skill to implement a plan like this on a site like this. And, I think from everything that I've seen, with Langen to date, that their team is well equipped to handle this type of situation. But we definitely want to make sure that the plans are well thought out and that those types of possibilities are addressed.
Thank you, Laura. Do we have any other committee members who haven't had a chance? Okay, I have a very quick question regarding this. How do you envision timing if there's another COVID outbreak? I know the city is recovering, but there's Delta variant and the cases are actually rising in the city. So how do you envision timing and what are you going to do to prepare for that if there's another outbreak?
Another great question. I mean, we have not had an opportunity yet to get into a dialogue with the agencies, and especially beyond just 10,000-foot level details. And I have not spoken to DOH yet, and I haven't had any real, think tank sessions, which we're probably going to wind up having by phone at least, to talk about some of these issues. So I can't answer that exactly right now from where we sit in terms of what would happen. I mean, that's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but it's definitely something that needs to be, factored in.
Thanks again. Okay, so I think we're going to get on to the briefly coming grade. Children first, what you say from this representing.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for being here today. I do want to say that I feel like the results that we've seen from the soil samples taken and everything is a great vindication to our community that has fought so hard to make sure that this remediation is done carefully, and that all of the risks and the concerns that we had around the contaminants at the site are real. And so I just want to remind everyone of what it took over the last 2 years for us to get to this place, between the parents organizing, schools organizing, people are really speaking out. This is part of the community board one. So just really quickly on that, just to remind people how we got here. I have a question on the different tracks. So obviously, when it comes to the DEC, they're concerned about removing as many contaminants as possible for future use. But from a community perspective, most of us are just concerned about how many contaminants are going to be pulled out of the ground, which could potentially threaten, air pollution and also increase exposures to the people who are around. So how do we as a community think about what track would be best from an exposure perspective versus between 1, 2, and 3?
Well, I think in the case of the mercury impacted soil, I think that the removal of the concentrations that are the highest, what they refer to as the hotspot, is something that the agencies would have required, even if there wasn't going to be a development. I think that would have been a given, that they would need to remove the elevated mercury concentrations, because you don't want those to be there for future risk in terms of any disruption of the subsurface for any reason. And then beyond that, the historic fill material, could have been left behind and capped with a development. I don't think there would have been any directive from the agencies to remove the historic fill. But I mean, the plan does include that in preparation for the redevelopment. But the removal of the underground storage tanks would have been a given. That would have to have been done, because you can't leave leaking underground storage tanks in the ground. And the mercury impacted material, I believe, would have been a directive by DEC under any reasonable circumstance. So really, it's the historic fill that's being removed maybe more than it would have had to have been. But because of the redevelopment, it's necessary, and some amount of material would have to be removed really for any future development of the site, even a park. I mean, because you'd have to make grade around the perimeter of the site. You'd have to have everything flush with the, existing grade. So there would have been some material that needed to be removed. But yeah, I can't comment on beyond, DC's, conversations with us during the RI when the data were coming in. They were pretty much already saying that this mercury impacted material needs to be needs to be removed. You can't treat it in place, not effectively, not under the circumstances here. And it wouldn't be something that anybody would even attempt, I don't think.
Okay, but tracks 1, 2, and 3, I assume, incorporate the mercury removal in all 3 cases, correct? So,
the mercury removal would be addressed in all 3 tracks that they're looking at, 1, 2, and 4, because track 3 is not really applicable to the site. They're not proposing an alternative remediation standard. They're just going with published standards. So, and underground storage tanks, because again, you can't leave a leaking underground storage tank in place.
4, okay. And then just one other quick question. When I was reading about the site, it was a little bit alarming to me to think that there will be piles of soil sitting on the site during the remediation. And I wanted to hear from you how you believe that they will be able to contain the dust from piles of soil, contaminated soil on the site, and especially around sensitive receptors.
Right. No, I agree with you. When my first review of the plan, it sounded and it read like they were going to stockpile excavated soil and then make arrangements for disposal after the fact. But it looks more like now, and this is going to be one of our comments for sure, it looks more like now that they're proposing to characterize it through this remedial design investigation and get the advanced approval for disposal so they can load the trucks right up. They still might have to have some material. It won't be the mercury impacted material most likely. They may run into a situation where they have to stockpile, maybe the historic fill material. If it just happens logistically that they don't have enough trucks or something and they got ahead of themselves with the excavation, just because of, timing and just the overall construction components of the work, in which case they have to adhere to the provisions that are in the plan, which call for, covering stockpiles. And that's tricky. I mean, it is. It's hard to make sure that the stockpiles are going to be maintained properly every day, but that is what they would need to do. They would need to be covering things or have other provisions, depending upon the overall logistics plan, which is something that we haven't discussed with them yet. But we're definitely going to be looking at that because we definitely do not want to be having, fugitive dust emissions, coming off the site with soils that we know are, contaminated. So that's definitely going to be something that gets looked at very hard.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Laura. I think one last question from Maggie Delal.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a couple things. I wanted to piggyback on what Michael Kramer said earlier. It's disappointing that the DEC did not plan a community meeting. I've been reviewing these documents. They're long. The amount of detail on these plans are really sophisticated. And I feel like the community members need more support in understanding this draft. So I think that if there's a way for us to ask for a meeting, that we should. Laura, you've been really helpful tonight, so thank you. I just have two questions. I reviewed the phase 2 daily field reports over the spring. 2 concerning things came up. First, there were pictures of staff members that was working for Langen that were removing samples from the parking lot, and they had no protective safety gear on. They were only wearing disposable or like N95 masks. So I just wanted to point that out because, I think they were mentioning in this RIWP that they were, there's going to be all these safety protocols, but they had staff working with nothing on. Second of all, the level of mercury that was approaching action level. Many of the days the samples were taken around the thermometer factory footprint. This is pretty significant. There was an increase of mercury from 5 nanograms per meter cubed, which is the average ambient air levels, up to levels between 200 as high as 900. And I just want to ask you, Laura, if you think this is concerning because once they, these were tiny little samples that they were taking out of the ground, and the levels were increasing drastically. They didn't hit action level, like I'm aware of that, but it seems like a big leap when you only have tiny samples coming out of the ground. So my concern is that when they start taking the asphalt off, we're going to see much higher levels. So I just wondered what you thought about that. I mean, is this the time where maybe we need to ask for a tent? It just seems like using water to spray down the dust is going to be hard to control it. So thank you.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in that comment, but thank you for your comments. I mean, number one, the staff for Langen, the health and safety provisions do not include respiratory protection. I don't think there was any need for having a respirator or anything like that, because the levels that were documented on site did not come close to rising to that level. So I don't know. I mean, the protocols that they were using that we observed were consistent with the safety plan for worker safety and also for the community air monitoring plan. Because we did have periodic inspections on site during the majority of all the field activities. I think certain ones we were there for the whole time. Other ones we came in randomly and did spot checks. So we didn't observe any non-compliance with respect to Langen field staff. So, and I want to also just make a comment about, in general, I know this is hard for people to sort of get the perspective on, but because we came into the remedial investigation not having soil vapor data from total mercury, for mercury at all, there were provisions made to ensure that if anything was encountered, that there'd be actions that were taken. There was, emergency plans, there were, all kinds of actions and steps put in place. So we were relieved not to see, a massive site-wide mercury vapor issue, because had that been the case, then we definitely would be having a different discussion. Having said that, the reason why I want to see the test pit investigation done as part of the remedial design investigation is just for the reason that you're mentioning, to be able to get a better idea of, once you pull up a portion of the asphalt in the area where the mercury impacts have been documented, and you go down with an excavator or a backhoe to expose those soils, immediately you'll know whether or not there's going to be an issue or not. And we need to know that on a much smaller micro scale than in advance of the full-blown remedy implementation. Because I think it's very difficult to correlate what you can expect in air quality with mercury or volatile organics, for that matter, when you're drilling a boring that's 2 to 4 inches in diameter and you have a small annular space, if any, versus when you remove the asphalt cover and go down and excavate into this material. So that's why the remedial design investigation work plan should include test pits, and in that work plan should include the provisions for how those test pits are going to be done safely. So that's going to be something that I absolutely comment on and expect to have a lot of dialogue with the agencies and at some point, Langen and HHC. And I think they agree that we all need to know, we're not taking the chance that just because something wasn't done and found in terms of any real elevated concentrations during the RI, that's not going to be the case when they open the ground up. I mean, based on the type of mercury that's in the soil, there was some elemental, but the majority of it was not elemental. Elemental is the form of mercury that has the highest potential to be volatile. And although some was detected, it wasn't the majority of what was detected. The majority of it was an organometallic mercury that is not in a form that would be readily volatile. Having said that, we're not just going to be guessing. It's going to be done in a controlled way.
I'm just going to ask if you don't mind, Laura, just to answer questions that you haven't already answered. I think we did hear about the test pit. So if I could ask folks who are still calling in to just be aware of answers that have already been given and just make them as brief as possible. I think we have Elaine Kennedy, who has a question. And I think this time that is it, or was it somebody else in the room? Oh, Andrew. Okay,
Can you
sorry.
hear me?
Okay, Elaine.
Hello?
Welcome.
Hi, Elaine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for this meeting and the community board for your time and attention to this. Laura, I want to go back to just,
Speak up, Elaine. Speak up.
where we're tarping areas, especially areas where there are volatile organic compounds or mercury that's being removed and all of this. I mean, you even hesitated about tarping and how tricky that is. Wouldn't these areas, especially if they're in proximity to the Blue School or the Peck Slip School, be better off tented for the safety of everyone?
The determination, hi, Elaine. The determination of whether or not that would be warranted, I think, is not yet been made. So that's one of the things that will be discussed in the remedial design investigation when those data are back. Because what we've seen so far in the RI, the levels are not, elevated relative. The soil vapor investigation did not show elevated levels. The air quality data, as Maggie pointed out, there were some detections, but there was nothing indicative of a serious problem with mercury volatilization. But I'm not satisfied yet with that. And that's what I was saying, that the test pit investigation needs to be done, and we need to have that dialogue. So I think it's just premature right now from where we stand. Remember, the process has got to be data driven. I mean, we've talked about that from the beginning of the RI work plan development. And that is still the case. It needs to be a data-driven decision. So that we need to get the data to have a better idea of what would be necessary.
I understand that, but you also understand all the fears this community have because we have so many sensitive receptors in the area. And I understand from your perspective, you can say that with some type of confidence, but we can't afford any risk here. We are just unwilling as a community to assume any risk. And if a tent would soothe, tenting the areas that you're working on, which are next to the Blue School or next to the Peck Slip School, would soothe some of these concerns, would it be worth it from easing a community's concerns?
I mean, there's no doubt that addressing the community's concerns is what, that's what I'm doing. And I'm trying to ensure that the approach that we take is data driven and defensible, because we have to be sure that what we're asking for is supported by the data that we've got. And for volatile organics to be tented on this site, there's just not enough in the form of volatile organic impacts to really warrant it for just volatile organics. I mean, I can tell you that from the data that we've got already. I mean, there were no volatile organic readings whatsoever during the entire remedial investigation. Traces of volatile organics here and there, other than in the immediate vicinity of the underground storage tanks. But we're talking fuel oil there. We're not talking anything that would indicate or result in a tremendous, issue with volatile organics. The primary inhalation hazard from the data we have right now are particulates, dust, and airborne, particulates. That's really where I think the highest risk is, aside from the potential for, as the mercury impacted soil is excavated into, for something to be found that could potentially result in a volatile mercury situation. That latter part hasn't been shown to be the case yet, but I don't think we're done with evaluating whether or not there's a potential for that. And so I think that how debris is going to be handled is something that I still want to get into more detail on. And I want to make sure that the approach is designed so that it can be done safely. It has to be done safely. I mean, I absolutely 100% am in agreement that this community is not, canaries in a cage. That's not what this is. And it's not going to be done that way. I mean, my commitment to you is that we're going to ask the questions to get to a level of comfort that we have a plan that is appropriate for the protection of the community. So again, we're still in the early stages of this process because, I still have another layer of review that gets into the details. So that's the reason why we had tonight's meeting, was so that, I could at least give you the overview and then let you know where I still haven't finished my review and my work, and listen to your comments to make sure that we're getting your comments incorporated into the thought process. So,
thanks very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, Elaine, for your question. Two more questions. Anybody else who's not in the room on stage, feel free to write in your questions, and we will absolutely get them to Laura Dodge. I'm going to take two more questions. We have a committee member, Andrew Zelter. You had something?
Yeah, quickly, and I arrived late, so apologies if this has been covered, and if so, no need to repeat it or discuss it now. But I've heard a lot about the site monitoring. Is there a monitoring plan for the broader neighborhood, and if so, is there a radius defined for what that might be?
The community air monitoring plan is incorporated, which has 6 community air monitoring stations that will be around the perimeter, 2 on Pearl, 2 on Water, 1 on Beekman, 1 on Peck. There'll be 1 interior to the site as well, and then there'll be a dedicated monitor with handheld instruments who will be going around the perimeter. Those camp stations will be moved off-site the way they were during the RI implementation, in the event that work is within 20 feet of the interior of the site, within the property boundary. They'll be moved off-site, and then that downwind monitor will be going around the site, dedicated individual doing nothing but that. So.
Got it, thank you.
Thanks. Last question is from another member of Children First, Megan Malvern. I want to also thank Children First, as Grant well pointed out. They have been very instrumental in bringing this all to our attention, and we thank them. And thank you, Laura, and those folks who thank you available to us. Megan Malvern, are you there?
I'm only going to stop talking unless someone says they can't hear me. So my one question, Laura, and I understand that in the RAWP and the state-run brownfield program, everything is data-driven. It's about what are the facts and what is the best result. It's sort of a cost analysis that we've already discussed at one point. The problem is this cost analysis is outside of the scope of the ULERT process and the negotiations that a council member could achieve for our community in terms of unprecedented levels of safety or sort of cooperation with a developer. Alan Gerson, when PS 234 was undergoing a very similar but less toxic sort of situation, was able to achieve, and it is literally considered unprecedented levels of noise mitigation and cooperation around school schedules. None of this is within the data-driven points of the RAWP, and therefore will be circumvented by initiating any of the processes through the brownfield that we don't get extra sort of, care from our council member in the ULERT process. So I know that we're talking about data-driven, but I'm not sure if Howard Hughes cares if my 4th grader does well on his state program, test to get into middle school. There's data, and then there's real life people who are living here. And I believe that the RAWP being outside of the ULURP process is detrimental, and it undermines what the entire process was meant to be for our community through negotiations. How do we rectify these things?
The noise control aspect of it is another thing I'm still getting through the detail of the document that falls into the logistics side of it as well. So it's sort of a holistic evaluation that we'll be doing with respect to how the work is actually going to be done. So walk me through a day on this site, when you get out there and you're, getting ready to do the mercury impacted soil excavation. So we will definitely be addressing issues of noise, issues of when the work will be done during the day, what's the time frame. All of that will be addressed. I don't know from where I sit right now because of this, 1,400-page document, and is a process that I have when I review a document like this, and it's you start from the 10,000 foot level down to the 1,000 foot, down to the 100 foot, and then that's the next level for me. But I will definitely be looking at that. Whether it's ULURP or not, from my point of view, it's a quality of life issue, and it's something that we need to discuss and ensure that there's, we understand what provisions are going to be made. So I will definitely be looking at that. But as Alice or Diana said, I'm not sure who, definitely provide your comments to CB1 so that I have all of that in front of me, and, will ensure that all of these things I look at and that we get a dialogue after I've gotten everything. This is not going to be the first time that we have a chance to talk. Yeah.
Laura, thank you very much. Thanks very much. That was a really tremendously helpful presentation and terrific questions at the beginning of this phase of the discussion. I think we would all agree in this room, and we have a lot of heavy hitters in here, including the Manhattan Borough President, Patty Washington here, if we could push forward in the idea of arranging for this meeting with DEC and Langen, and I'm looking right at the call here, to have the community with the principle of textbook school and blue school. What we had done originally when we looked over the remedial investigation work plan, to come together. Now we have the extra 30 days, maybe we'll even get to see early in September. I'm looking at Grace for this, to schedule this so that there can be additional question and answer, which I think we all would agree is really quite edifying and important. So if all parties involved that are here tonight agree to that in some way, to get around the same table, much like we're doing tonight, maybe a bigger one, that would be great. So we're going to follow through with DEC and Langen, I hope, and Borough President maybe could even lend us some space and such. Okay. Thank you. We need another 30 days. Yeah, we're also lobbying for that. Yes, we haven't forgotten to get to 60 days plus the meeting. It does seem essential, and they don't seem like big apps, I have to be honest. So I really hope that can, move forward on that. And with that, I think we're going to move on to the HHC team talking to us a little bit about the environmental impact statements, well related to what we've just discussed. And Laura, I want to thank you again for your extraordinary work. It's really helpful.
No, thank you. A lot of really good questions. Thank you. And
we'll be back.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to stay for the whole EIS discussion. I mean, that's okay.
Yeah, Sarah. Okay. Understood.
No offense, Howard Hughes.
I don't know if all you want to have any
I'm just going to make
comment here.
Generally, I think everyone in this room knows me, but for those that are listening in that don't know me, hi, I'm Skull Squirrel, for the tri-state region. If you can't hear me, let me know, please. I want to thank, first of all, it's so nice to see everyone in person healthy. I know this is a great setup, but really nice to see that everyone's healthy under these challenging circumstances. Thank you all on this committee for what you do and the hard work, and all the members of the community board. I know you guys, the team really puts in a lot of work in your consideration of our projects, and generally what everyone does for the Seaport and for Lower Manhattan. at large. As all of you know, the parking lot at 250 Water has been a gap in the fabric for over 5 decades. Our proposal would transform the lot into a mixed-use development that would enhance and create a welcoming gateway, we believe, to the South Street Seaport Historic District. The project, the design for which has been approved as appropriate now by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, will also create permanent, deeply affordable housing in the neighborhood where none little exists today. It will also bring thousands of jobs and patrons to all of our local restaurants and small businesses, and we believe it will spur the local economic development when our city needs it most. And importantly, the project will also make possible significant funding for the South Street Seaport Museum, which is an essential component of our historic district, allowing it to restore, reopen its historic buildings and plan, most importantly, for the future expansion in the heart of our district. This evening, our team will present the findings from the project's draft environmental impact statement, also known as the DEIS, which looks at the projected effects of the project on the neighborhood, the infrastructure, local historic resources, and much more. The DEIS also lays out potential mitigations where necessary. As you know, the draft EIS examined a building somewhat larger than the current LPC-approved design. So the final environmental impact statement will consider the LPC-approved project and will also take into account public comments from this evening made on the DEIS. Throughout this comprehensive review process, we've sought to be responsive to your feedback and look forward to hearing your input on the DEIS. We hope that tonight's presentation will help the community forward as you prepare comments in connection with the City Planning Commission's public hearing on the project. Thank you for your input, your time, your consideration. I'm now going to hand it over to our team members from Charlie from AKRF and David from Free Press.
Thank you, Saul. Hi, everybody. My name is Charlie Fields. I'm from AKRF, the environmental consultant for the project. We work with the city, Department of City Planning, who is the lead agency under SEEKR, and the Howard Hughes team in the preparation of the EIS, which is the subject of tonight's discussion. I also have with me and online some members of our technical team on WebEx to help answer any questions you might have. And there is a slideshow, so I'll be referring to the screen up here. Next slide, please. I'm going to describe the analysis framework used in the DEIS, discuss the key technical areas and findings of the DEIS, and also describe some of the project refinements that Saul referenced that we're expecting to incorporate into the final DEIS. Next slide, please. Many of you are familiar with the proposed actions, which are shown on the right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time drilling down on those. But I'm going to provide a brief overview of the analysis framework and the technical areas that we looked at. The left part of the slide shows the project area that we considered. It includes the two primary sites in the DEIS, the development site at 250 Water Street, which is shown in purple, and the South Street Seaport Museum shown in orange. The museum site includes the site for potential expansion at the John Street lot that is currently vacant. And the red outline includes those sites, as well as the boundary of the modified large-scale development. So let's talk about the DEIS analysis framework and some of the changes that will be looked at in the FEIS. Next slide, please. This table shows the no-action and with-action development programs, as well as the incremental difference between the two that forms the basis for the environmental analysis. In the no-action condition, the development site is anticipated to be redeveloped with a new as-of-right building, totaling about 327,000 gross square feet. Development under the no-action condition would be a mixed-use building containing market-rate residential uses with ground floor retail and community facility space, as well as below-grade parking. For the with-action condition, the DEIS looked at the construction of a mixed-use building of about 680,000 gross square feet, which would contain market-rate and affordable housing, retail, office space, and community facility space, as well as parking. What the DEIS uses as a basis for evaluating impacts is the difference or increment between the no action and the with action conditions. Generally, I would note that the with action condition takes a conservative approach in determining a reasonable worst case development scenario, which we come up with the Department of City Planning for analysis purposes. For example, the EIS uses a standard seeker size of 1,000 square feet per unit, which results in a higher unit count than HHC actually intends to build. For the purposes of the environmental review, it's assumed that the proposed project would also facilitate the restoration, reopening, and potential expansion of the South Street Seaport Museum. And the FEIS and the EIS analyses consider the full increment of the museum's operations. Next slide, please. As you know, and I saw reference, the building that was ultimately approved by landmarks is somewhat smaller than that which was looked at in the DEIS. This slide shows on the left the maximum building envelope that was analyzed in the draft EIS. That's the blue box outline. On the right is a smaller design that we expect to analyze in the final EIS. Overall height has gone from 395 feet to 324 feet. Although in the revised design, you can also see that the envelope sort of steps down from the highest point compared to the much broader envelope of that box that was considered in the DEIS. Next slide, please. The changes to the building massing are also reflected in the program square footages. This slide shows the DEIS assumptions as well as what we expect to look at for the FEIS. In the FEIS, there will be a bit more residential and retail space and less office space. Overall, the building will be about 64,000 gross square feet smaller. The assumptions for the museum site remain the same. Next slide, please. As shown in this slide, the DEIS looked at a broad range of the technical areas covered under SEQA, using the SEQA technical manual as guidance. For each of the environmental areas, the draft EIS...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Could you try to speak up and enunciate a little more? The microphone for our virtual attendees is over here, so...
Am I allowed to take my mask off?
Yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
When it comes to the pure, I can look.
Thank you.
I'll just shout at the mic.
Could you just,
The DIS looked at a broad range of technical areas covered under SEQA using the SEQA technical manual for guidance. For each of the environmental areas, the draft EIS considered potential project impacts in the analysis year of 2026 and also accounted for other approved or planned background projects likely to be completed by that time. Next slide, please. This slide shows the areas in which the project could have a significant adverse impact, shown in bold. They include shadows falling on open space, historic resources, transportation, and construction. I'll go through each of these technical areas, discuss potential mitigation, and talk about some of the other areas of concern as well. Next slide, please. For the shadows analysis, 40 resources in the surrounding area were analyzed, including publicly accessible open spaces, historic resources, and natural resources. The shadow study area is shown in the right side of the slide there in the radius. Of the resources considered, it was determined in the DEIS that there would be a significant adverse impact on one privately owned open space, which is a portion of the Southbridge Towers complex that's across Pearl Street from the 250 site. It's worth noting again that the DEIS was conservatively analyzing the maximum zoning envelope, which was larger than what was ultimately approved at LPC. As such, we expect that the extent of the shadows will be reduced for the FEIS using the LPC approved building. But we don't expect that the impact will go away. Next slide, please. Looking more closely at the affected area, and this material is in the EIS. There's a number of diagrams if you want to look at those. You can see that the incremental shadows from the 250 site would fall on certain portions of the Southbridge Tower's open spaces during the morning when the sun is in the eastern sky. This example diagram represents 9:15 a.m. on the March-September analysis day, and more or less represents the maximum coverage. By about 11 a.m., the project shadow would be completely off of the area. Potential mitigation measures identified in the DEIS could include replacing vegetation with more shade-tolerant plantings, plants that will survive and thrive in the shade, and additional maintenance of the open space features. Next slide, please. The DEIS considered the maximum building envelope and determined that it would have the potential to result in a contextual impact to historic resources. Potential contextual impacts on the surrounding historic district are anticipated to be removed in the FEIS, which will consider a building massing that is consistent with the LPC-approved design. The DEIS also examined archaeological resources, and with a plan for additional testing and monitoring, there would be no archaeological impacts. Next slide, please. The transportation section of the DEIS considered the project's potential effects on local traffic, parking, and pedestrian conditions, as well as public transit services. Traffic conditions were evaluated at 4 Pearl Street intersections for the weekday AM, midday, and PM peak hours. Pedestrian conditions were evaluated at 8 sidewalks, 10 corners, and 3 crosswalks for the weekday, AM, midday, and PM peak hours. Transit trips would not exceed the seeker threshold for analysis of bus and subway conditions, and there would be no impacts to those. An evaluation of parking area parking conditions determined that there would not be a parking shortfall. Next slide, please. For vehicular traffic, potential impacts were identified at 3 intersections along Pearl Street, at Beekman Street, and at the areas next to the bridge. Those are shown in red. Proposed mitigations include signal timing changes at the intersection of Pearl and Beekman Streets, which would fully mitigate the identified impact during the weekday, midday peak hour, while the remaining identified impacts would be unmitigated. And it's worth noting that the majority of the impacts, which is really delays of getting through an intersection, would be less than 20 seconds. Next slide, please. For pedestrian conditions, significant adverse impacts were identified for one location, the southeast corner of Pearl Street and Frankfurt Street, during the weekday, midday, and PM peak hours. And that corner is shown, you can't quite see it here, but it's up under the block there in the upper right. The impacts identified at this corner could be fully mitigated by a 6-foot curb extension on the Frankfurt Street side of the corner. Next slide, please. The DEIS also looked at the effects of the project's construction, including traffic, air quality, and noise. The slide shows the construction time frame presented in the DEIS. The major stages would include excavation and foundation work, building the superstructure, exteriors, interiors, and final site work. Overall, construction would last approximately 36 months. For comparative purposes, the no-action building would take about 5 months less overall. The DEIS identified that the project's construction activities could result in significant adverse impacts in terms of noise, including noise to open space, and traffic. Next slide, please. For construction traffic, it's anticipated that any significant adverse traffic impacts would be of equal or lesser magnitude than those disclosed in the operational analyses, and that the same or similar mitigation measures could be used to address construction-related impacts. There could be unmitigatable significant adverse traffic impacts on Pearl Street, at Beekman and Frankfurt Street during the construction AM peak hour. Next slide, please. The DEIS assessed the effects of construction noise on receptors surrounding the proposed construction work areas, including schools, open space, and residential buildings. Certain receptors would experience noise impacts because nearby construction could produce noise that would be noticeable and potentially intrusive during the most noise-intensive activities. The most noise-intensive construction would be during the excavation and foundation phase and occur for up to approximately 6 months. Again, for comparison, these phases, the most disruptive phases for an as-of-right building would be about a month short, 5 months. Next slide, please. There are a number of noise reduction measures that will be implemented, including using equipment that meets mandated sound level standards, using electrical equipment as early as possible, and locating non-electric equipment within buildings to the extent feasible, locating noisy equipment away from shielded from sensitive receptors where logistics permit, committing to specific equipment that is less noisy, for example, hoists and chipping guns, configuration of construction sites to minimize backup alarms and idling restrictions, noise barriers around the construction sites, staging concrete operations along Pearl Street inside site perimeter noise barriers, and the use of portable noise barriers or enclosures for certain dominant noise equipment to the extent feasible and practicable. And other construction noise mitigation measures are being explored as well. Next slide, please. For construction air quality, the DEIS determined that there would be no impact from construction emissions with the implementation of certain measures, including a dust control plan, restrictions on truck idling, use of cleaner ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, use of electrically powered equipment to the extent practicable, use of best available tailpipe reduction technology, such as diesel particulate filters, and utilization of newer equipment with lower emissions. Next slide, please. The DEIS also assessed the effects of construction vibration on structures and residences near the construction site. Although no impact from construction vibration is expected, a construction protection plan will be developed and implemented in consultation with LPC. The purpose of the construction protection plan is to avoid inadvertent damage during construction to the historic buildings that are located within 90 feet of the construction site. Among other things that I'll talk about in a second, the CPP would require vibration monitoring and prohibit vibrations from exceeding acceptable thresholds. If for some reason the thresholds were to be exceeded, the CPP would require construction means and methods to be altered to avoid such exceedances. Next slide, please. There are also a number of measures that will be employed to ensure public safety during construction. These will include sidewalk bridges, safety signage, safety barriers, flag persons to control truck movements and provide guidance to pedestrians and cyclists, and safety netting. In addition, as I mentioned, or as has been referenced, a construction health and safety plan would be developed prior to construction, which would address emergency conditions such as a storm event. Such measures would include safely securing all construction equipment and containing any fill that's stockpiled on site using applicable best management practices such as impervious covers or temporary seeding for any fill that's held on site. So just a little more detail on the construction protection plan. In addition to protecting nearby buildings from inadvertent damage from ground or vibration, the CPP will cover things like protection from falling debris and accidental damage from heavy machinery during project construction. The CPP measures typically include protective coverings, pre-construction survey, vibration monitoring and crack monitoring, optical monitoring, and preparing reports. Next slide, please. The DEIS also considered hazardous materials conditions. And as you know, and as Laura reported on earlier, the 250 Water Street site is in the Brownfields Cleanup Program administered by the state. And I know you guys are intimately aware and familiar with that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time rehashing that. But the DEIS does cross-reference that, and in summary, remedial action investigation would be undertaken, construction health and safety plan would be implemented, and the work plan is proposed to include the camp, tank commissioning and de-removal, site-wide excavation and disposal of impacted soil, excavation and removal of sources of groundwater contamination, and treatment if necessary, as well as post-remediation analysis of the soil. What's also relevant here is that as part of the city approval process, an E-designation will be put on the site to provide additional assurance that cleanup takes place with or without the Brownfields Cleanup Program. And it's worth noting, and Laura talked about it too, that activities for remediation and the excavation and construction will be closely coordinated. For the John Street lot, which is not part of the Brownfields Cleanup Program, measures would include the completion of a Phase 2 investigation and preparation of a ROP and CHASP, and a remedial plan to address any residual contamination that would be prepared and approved. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit about some of the sustainability measures incorporated into the proposed project. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the project was determined in the DEIS to be consistent with the city's emission reduction goals. The project is committed to a LEED Silver certification for the development site, and the applicant is working and studying strategies to reach higher levels of performance. The proposed building is anticipated to reduce energy consumption by approximately 18% and GHG emissions by 15%. Specific sustainability measures could include landscape roofs or high albedo roofs, submetering of electricity usage, regenerative braking for elevators, lighting controls, sustainability guidelines for tenant build-outs, meeting or exceeding city and LEED requirements for stormwater retention, along with reuse for irrigation, a design that can accommodate fully electric systems for commercial and office spaces with the ability to convert to residential spaces. And finally, provisions to encourage bicycle, scooter, and electric vehicle usage. Resiliency is also a very important part of the project. The DEIS assessed the resiliency of the project and determined that the project would not affect the floodplain or result in the increased risk of flooding in adjacent areas. Flooding in the vicinity of the project is controlled by astronomic tides and meteorological forces and is unaffected by the occupancy of a building in the floodplain. As such, the proposed project would not result in increased risk of flooding to adjacent areas or buildings. As part of the EIS, the project was determined to be consistent with the city's waterfront revitalization program, including its resiliency policies. The project would include design features or the ability to retrofit for features to address flood risks through the end of the century. Resiliency measures would include consistency with Appendix G of the zoning code and the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. Critical infrastructure would be elevated above the floodplain, or in the case of the cellar, dry flood-proofed. Flood-resistant glazing and flood walls would be incorporated at the ground floor, and the building would be designed to allow for future retrofitting with adaptive measures such as flood barriers. thank you all very much, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody else presenting from, that's it? Okay, well, all right, questions, comments, from the committee members?
Alan.
Sure, yes, Vera.
Yeah, I have a question. On your traffic study, you mentioned there's only 4 points. Is there any reason why you didn't look at the traffic impact along Fulton Street, John Street, South Street, and Water Street?
Well, it's sort of a screening process to determine which would be most affected. So while there would be some trips going, obviously, through the whole network, those intersections that would have more than 50 trips passing through them as part of the project's incremental traffic are the ones that are looked at.
Okay, so
anything that's not on Pearl Street there would have less than 50 trips passing through it during a peak hour.
okay. And then I know that John Street and Fulton Street are really, they have a lot of traffic going through those intersections in South Street as well too, so. Okay.
Yeah.
2 questions. One, to follow up on a question that I asked of Laura in terms of the trucks taking away, in case of that, talking to Laura, taking away the contaminated soil and so forth, and where they might be staged. I didn't look carefully at the construction portion of the DEIS. Does it indicate, and do you know where you would plan to take away any street space for staging? Does it indicate whether part of Water Street would be taken, or Pearl, or whatever borders that side?
There wouldn't be, and Kenny can help me answer this one. We did work with the design team and the construction managers to look at what the logistics plan might look like during construction. And the goal is to not close any streets and to minimize disruption to the traffic network. Where possible, getting them off, when you can, get them off the street. And I think there's an enclosure for some operations.
Well, I mean, you can see around
The preliminary plans are primarily to do that on Pearl Street.
Okay. And do you know where you would anticipate in terms of getting rid of the debris, where those trucks would be staged? Is it your intention to stage them within the property itself, so you don't have to worry about contaminated dust on, let's say, on Pearl Street on the edge, where it's closer to the perimeter?
Well, I think we need to work with Ryan on coming up with a removal plan as far as the trucks go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Mimi may be on the line from Langen, if she can hear this. She could probably add some more, but I think as Laura said during the earlier meeting, there's a lot more in-depth work to do to plan all that out in detail, and we'll be doing that, in the coming months, including taking into account the comments at this meeting and others.
Okay. I think it's probably safe to say that the residents would, and the community board would prefer that kind of loading of the debris to take place, within the site as opposed to near the periphery, just to reduce the risk of the contamination flowing outside of the site. My second question had to do with the shadow studies. I noticed and perhaps this is part of the legal requirement, we focus on, loss of green space or impact on green space and so forth. Do you also have to take into account shadows on adjacent buildings? I mean, if you're clouding up green space in Southbridge, almost certainly you're clouding up people's apartments that otherwise had sun, or is that not an environmental consideration that you need to mitigate in withholding the green space?
That's right. Well, the short answer is no. It doesn't look at private residences. It wouldn't look at a private terrace. It doesn't look at sort of interior light conditions for surrounding buildings. There is an exception which relates to buildings that may have stained glass window that are historic, a designated historic resource. So it does look at it from that angle. As far as the structure is concerned, that's not open space. And then it looks at natural resources, which might not be a park or a playground, but for example, this study looked at shadows falling on the East River because it's being used for fish and other things, so it's taken into consideration.
And with respect to the green space at South Bridge, that even with the reduced LPC height, I gather since it's right across the street, it's likely to be impacted pretty significantly with a slightly lower building. Would you intend to reach out to the Southbridge board to work on mitigation measures with them? I mean, how do the mitigation measures get implemented?
I can speak to that. West Wales Rhino Police, right? That's an example. The mitigation measures are typically implemented through the restrictive declaration. And for this type of space where it's a privately owned space, and this is all, of course, to come in the FEIS, subject to public input, but a typical requirement would be to reach out to the board or to the ownership of the building and to monitor the conditions of the planting in time, and then to replace as necessary.
Okay, so the remediation would be on your dollar, not on their dollar?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Wendy.
Thanks for this presentation, by the way, it's helpful. One thing that's how are you working with the Peck Slip School specifically? Because, you know, they use the street as their playground. You know, we're pretty proud on the Youth and Ed Committee of getting that special permission to close the streets since they have, you know, a real density problem in the school. And you know, when the school is designed, everyone is supposed to be on that upstairs outside play space, which immediately proved to be not enough space. So they use the street, and you all know that. What's the situation during construction for use of the street as a playground?
The intention is for it to remain open for play. So that's, you know, we've directed our team to come up with a logistics plan that enables that area to be open safely. And we're going to be coordinating closely with the school to make sure that that is open to the greatest extent possible.
With protected bridges or whatever needs to be over to make sure that the kids are protected.
Yeah, you know, and I'm sure you know Maggie really well there. You know, I'm sure the children are going to be very interested in what's happening next door. Is there any sort of actual, you know, maybe make it something that the children actually can understand what's happening next door? Because when the whole food tower went up next to 234, I mean, you know, there's going to be some negatives, as we know, when they're driving piles and things like that. But, you know, there's also positives in terms of learning about engineering and all the challenges of that. But do you have a plan for that? I mean, especially as a son who's now probably going to become an engineer, there are kids that are going to be, when they're little, this is going to make a big impact on the way they think about their world. Do you have any plans for that?
We don't have specific plans yet, but it's a great idea, and it's something that we've talked about, and we have a good dialogue ongoing with Peck Slip School and with the principal, Maggie.
Yeah, I'm sure that Blue School and other schools like that, because I mean, the children are going to be incredibly curious about what's happening across, especially because their parents will be talking about it. So.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll stop. Nobody has any other questions or comments on the entire environmental testing study for 250 Water Street. We get a million questions on the zoning, but nothing on this. Yes, Michael.
I'm sure everybody in the room and everybody listening is happy to hear that this construction can go on for 3 years and there won't be any significant impact on anything. We're all quite reassured by that. But maybe we could get into a little bit more detail about the shadow study, for example. And could you speak a little bit more about Smith Houses? Could you speak more about Southbridge? Can you speak more about how this will actually impact upon them? Let's forget about what the CEQA requirements are. In real life, what will it mean?
While you're making those comments, I will just add in also the two playgrounds. Those are impacted for almost the most hours in the day, right? Those are 3 hours approximately each in those playgrounds.
And there's open street, which is not technically a playground, but...
Right, and you could comment on the playgrounds in addition to
there are three playgrounds.
Michael identified? And also, what assurance is there in your mitigation efforts that they come to fruition? Like, is there some sort of, what sort of legal document is there that allows the community to know that the mitigation that you're describing, whether it's gold lead, which is in the document, now it's moved down to silver, where these things get sort of memorialized in a real way?
I can start with this final question. The commitments from the EIS and the mitigation measures become memorialized in the restrictive declaration, and that will be a commitment that is a requirement, that is a condition to the special permit and the City Planning Commission approval. So before the project can be built, they'll have to execute a restrictive declaration. It's recorded in the property record, and it ensures that forevermore, anytime they move forward with the project, pursuant to the special permit, they have to comply with all of the terms of the mitigation.
Who negotiates those terms on behalf of the community?
It is taken from the EIS, from the final EIS. So the lead agency, City Planning, will distill the required mitigation measures, and through their counsel's office, they put that into the restricted declaration.
And is that linked directly to the promises about the museum, the Seaport Museum?
The museum commitments are separate from that. They're not.
Can I just ask a couple of things? First of all, let's go in order of the questions.
Yeah.
Let's get Michael's question answered with my two additions. Thanks, Wes, for getting onto that legal question. But if you could also, if you don't mind, and you don't feel like you're going to die from this, just take down your mask when you're talking so we can actually hear you and really speak up, because we're getting a lot of complaints here about not hearing things. Okay, so Michael.
Yeah, if you want to come to the front where the mic is, that might make sense.
The mic is just not, there's a mic soon, owl over there.
No, it's through this.
This one?
This one, okay.
As far as the shadows are concerned, there are shadows. It's all building, like any development in Manhattan, including when they built Southbridge Towers itself, cast shadows. So it's not a surprise. It's the size of the shadow, the extent of the shadow, and the duration of the shadow falling on different resources. One of the blessings of shadows is they're always moving. So they're on one part of a resource, and then an hour later they're moving on another, and then they will finally move off. But the EIS, discloses all of the ones that were looked at, and shows what the times were for the various open spaces and playgrounds. And you have to remember, ultimately, it's not Howard Hughes or AKRF that makes the determination as to what is an impact versus just having a shadow effect where a shadow falls on something. It's the lead agency. So, and using the secret technical manual, which is the guidance provided by the city for conducting these analyses. And all said and done, it was the Southbridge Towers because of the size. You could see from the extent of it, and it would be on there for a decent amount of time, although it would move off by 11 o'clock in the morning, was determined to be a significant adverse shadow. So we do acknowledge that there are shadows on other resources and stuff in the area. We're not trying to hide it.
All right, so let's talk about the transportation hotspots, for example. Do you feel that the service road that will now become drop-off points for private vehicles for the tin building, and that will then exit up at Beekman and go to Pearl, would that contribute to it being a hotspot, and would it be mitigated if it couldn't?
Well, really, the loop road, you're talking about the loop road coming into Pier 17.
And exiting on Beekman.
And exiting at Beekman. Yeah, it would not operate with any problems. Those are trips that are now coming to the site and basically discharging people on South Street.
No, right now it's just freight.
Who would be coming
Right,
through.
but the cars are still coming to
They're
South
backing
Street.
up.
They're still coming to South Street. This just brings them off.
Right.
Right,
It's just a
and
reality.
you're looking at 12 o'clock in the afternoon is what you presented to us. Is that the peak time for the tin building?
Peak time for the tin building? No, would not be at 12 now.
Thank you. I mean, you can go through all of these, you know, the construction, and what do you say to the parents who have kids in effect split school and the blue school for the next 3 years?
Well, 3 years also, remember, those are different they're different elements of the construction, as pointed out by Charlie in the slide. So certain phases are more disruptive than others, but a significant chunk of that 3-year period, you've got that interior construction in the building, which is less disruptive. So they acknowledge that it's, you know, it has an effect, but it's New York City and we're in an urban environment and buildings get built. But the EIS, as well as, you know, our teams, you know, committing to best practices and responsible development are going to mitigate and minimize that effect to the greatest extent.
Have you studied instances where the construction has gone on next to schools? For example, I think it was PS 59, was it?
51.
51, excuse me, on up in the Hell's Kitchen, and what methods and means were used to mitigate so that the kids could go to school?
I haven't studied that particular school, but I know we are looking at other instances, and I know our design team members of our design team were involved in 2 different projects with schools, the one in Tribeca, as well as one on the east side. So yes, we are drawing on those examples to inform our plan.
And then, just a note, the Tribeca one was painful. We lived through it, it was painful. So if there's ways to do it better, neighbors would appreciate it.
I think Maggie may have been there at the time, so she should know.
Other questions from committee members?
I have it's actually not about the GIS. I know you're gonna get a curb cut on Pearl Street. What's the approval process gonna be for that? Are you gonna go through Euler for that, or is there gonna be an MDO?
The curb cut requires an authorization.
Authorization only from whom?
The City Planning Commission.
Okay.
It has been presented in the application that it's been referred to the committee.
Okay.
Okay, that's it from the committee members. You know, if anything else might float in there, but in the meantime, we're going to head over to participants.
So we have 2 board members who are attending virtually.
Great.
The first is Paul Goldstein, and the second is Rosa Chang. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, good evening. Speaking of mitigation, remediation, I think the answer, in my experience, is not to rely on city planning, but rather to make sure our elected officials play the heavy role in terms of getting these remediation measures implemented. And they have to be assured to the community in advance. This position that, oh, we should wait and monitor things before we agree. I don't think we're ever going to see mitigation if we wait that long. Certainly when PS 234 went up many years ago, this community board played an extremely active role, and it worked with Alan Gerson, then the council member, and he managed to get shrouding on the pile drivers. Are you listening, Alice?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Shrouding on the pile drivers, and there are other means to put in piles aside from pile driving these days. You could almost like screw them in, which is much quieter. So I think all those methods should be examined to consider the noise impacts on the schools and on the community in general. Another thing that can be done that helped a little bit in that case was to build a big fence around the construction site. Yeah, it doesn't solve all the problems, but a thick enough wood fence will mitigate some of the noise. So these were things that were done in the past. I know Alan Gerson, I know members of his staff who worked on this. We can talk to them and get more details if needed. I think, again, in following up to what Jeff was saying about open space and shadows, especially concerning Southbridge, I think those issues have to be addressed now, not later. We need to get assurances from either the developer or our electeds that these are going to be in any approved building that may end up ultimately getting approved for that site. And again, these mitigation measures were indeed put in at the last minute by the elected officials before the city council voted. So I think we should be in contact with them, and the interest groups like the schools, et cetera, should continue those conversations. And the same thing for the traffic mitigation. I didn't really hear, basically what they were saying is, yeah, we may need some mitigation here, maybe there, maybe not. I don't know if those are adequate answers. I don't think so. Certainly in the past, we got assurances of like 20 additional traffic agents for different projects that were built that would have traffic impacts on this community. So I think, again, those type of commitments should be tried to achieve before any final EIS is done. And certainly if the developer was trying to be the good neighbor that he likes to portray himself as, they would just be offering these things without sort of saying, let's wait and see. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Paul. Rosa Chang?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the presentation. I basically had 3 questions. One is noise, the other is air quality, and the third is affordable housing. So regarding noise, I do have, very strong concerns about this 2 schools specifically across the street. We're expecting children to essentially live through, 3 years of extremely loud construction and learn through that process. And I think learning through even just regular days is difficult, but through construction, right next door is almost impossible. And so I would strongly, strongly urge you to really look at noise mitigation issues and possibilities, and really study that because it's a huge concern, and it's not possible to say to children who have no choice but to be there to basically try to focus on what you're learning as heavy machinery is doing work right outside your window. And it is 3 years, because while I recognize that when you're in the ground it's louder and there's more vibration, the reality is that the construction noise is incredibly disruptive until you're actually sealed up. And so that really is 3 years. And I don't think we can ask them to sacrifice 3 years of their education for this. The second is air quality. I would also urge you to look at upgrading the school's air handling units to be able to accommodate MERV 13 filters if they do not do so already. I know that the parents have a lot of concerns regarding air quality and particulates, and it would be helpful to have that addressed sooner rather than later. And then the third is actually a question regarding affordable housing. Is the number of affordable housing units that has been sort of discussed in the past based on gross square footage or zoning square footage allocated to residential, or is it based on the number of dwelling units?
Yeah, it's based on a percentage of the zoning floor area of the overall residential component.
Okay, so then the zoning square footage allocated to affordable housing will not change depending on the number of units or the size of market rate units that you would be providing, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, that's excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. I was concerned when reading your report that might not be the case, because it mentioned that the estimates that you're working off of were essentially 1,000 square foot per unit, and that you anticipated that the size of your units would actually be larger than that. And there was a little footnote at the bottom that indicated that also the number of units were open to change in terms of the affordable units.
Well, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, but by the number of units, you're basically saying it would still be the same allotment of zoning square footage for affordable, but that the sizes of the affordable housing units would change, and therefore the total overall delivered number of units would change.
It could change, yeah. That's
Okay,
correct.
understood. Any responses on the noise mitigation issues and the air quality? Specifically for the two schools directly across the street?
Well, I mean, we're taking, your comments are, well taken, and we certainly, that's all going to be considered in the formal EIS process, as well as our own process of planning and looking to minimize these impacts.
Okay, I would just ask you to think of it as if your own child were expected to go to school in that environment, what would you like to have done? Recognizing that the project is happening, what would you like to have done for your own child?
We understand.
Thank you.
I just remembered a construction.
Hang on a second.
I wanted to follow up.
Okay, Richard.
Can I follow up on that affordable housing question? I didn't quite follow the answer. As I saw from the presentation, the square footage of residential went up from the last project plan. So does that mean that the number of units will go up, or you're not clear about that yet? What's the impact of that change in square footage on the residential units?
It means it's likely to go up, but it depends on the size of the units, and we haven't fully designed the individual units and the layouts on each floor.
So either or both, the size of the units and the number of units should go up in this?
No, the size of the units wouldn't necessarily go up. The size of the units are going to be designed to, in the case of the affordable housing, there are certain standards that we'll comply with based on HBD regulations, and what's appropriate for, rental apartments. And for the condominiums, it's a design process to figure out the best mix, given, what we're seeing in the marketplace.
I think you're asking, did the square footage go up on the affordable? Is that the question you're asking?
Well, if the number of, if the affordable housing units is determined by the total a percentage of the total square footage of residential, which is what I think you said.
No, not the number of units, the square footage of units is determined based on the total square footage of residential.
The square footage of all affordable housing units.
Right.
Of the total amount of affordable housing. Right. And now you're saying that the size of those units is prescriptive based upon HPD's requirements.
Within a certain range.
Within a certain range. So if the total square footage goes up and the size of the units is already prescribed, then the number of units should go up. Is that, why does that not seem correct?
It's a range, so it depends on the floor, I think it depends on the floor plan and what the final floor plan looks like, whether there's some units that are a little bigger or smaller, that it could be the same number of units, but the total square footage of affordable goes up based on the fact that the residential portion. So if you also, the number of units could go up, it could stay the same, the units would get larger at that point. So it's just trying to understand the final layout based on the architect.
All right, sorry to jump in, but that was Richard's question. He was saying because the total square footage is going up, we're going to see an increase in either or both the size or the count. And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay, because the answer was no before, but now it's yes.
It's a yes.
Okay.
I don't think that's correct. I didn't answer it that way.
You're trying to say it depends. One of them's going to go up. Something's going to go up.
When do you give us that definitive information, Paul? When does the public get to know the answer to that question, as to how many units? Like, what's going to be the determinant in getting that information?
When we finish the plan.
It's design plans. the building.
But we may be able to report, earlier than that, a much tighter range, like it's gonna be 75 to 80 units for the affordable housing and 200, for the condos.
And at that point, will the community also be privy to what this building will be made out of and how that, enters into your argument that this will be a highly sustainable building and have all these wonderful resiliency features? We haven't seen any of that level of detail. When does that come to us?
Well, the materials, I think, were part of the LTC.
Certainly the exterior of the building is pretty well established through the LPC approval. The building, as we go through the design process for the interior and the full scale, the building will go through and be, working with DOT to permit the plans and so on. But we're also, we're also happy to answer questions as we get further along in that process, to the extent you have questions about specific, where we end up, for example, on LEED and some of these other things that are not, ironclad at this point.
Well, that's what I'm getting to. I think we've been asking that now for quite a while, and I think this committee particularly has a great interest in, what specifically is making this building sustainable. I mean, in the report you mentioned gold, now you're saying silver LEED, which is not necessarily the gold standard of the highest level. A lot of people here talk about passive house. Could you do more in terms of efforts towards sustainability? I mean, this building could become some sort of icon of goodwill towards sustainability. I don't know. We asked about stormwater retention. Is there, you mentioned that in the EIS, but where is that, for example, stormwater management? Is it in the building? I know we had asked about it. Is that something that's been considered in the?
It's something we're working on, and we have our architects on the line. If they can hear this, could answer that in more detail. But again, as I mentioned during the land use meeting, we're in the early stages of the schematic design, and as you move through the process and get into design, development, and construction documents, you really flesh all those things out in much greater detail. So I don't necessarily think it's productive to get into those types of things now, because we're just not at that stage in the process.
Yeah, I just was wondering when you would hit that stage, because in part, in looking over the EIS, those facts and figures are actually quite important, and I don't know how, in terms of this restrictive declaration, does it identify these materials? Does it identify whether it's LEED gold, LEED silver? It has stormwater management. It doesn't. Where does the community get to acknowledge and understand what precisely, are the benefits to the community in terms of what the environmental?
As an example, the stormwater management, there are standards, there are prescriptive standards in order to get your sewer connection, and so those are types of things that are referenced in the EIS. And based on that, they can determine how much stormwater flow is going into the system at a certain time period. So for that, there's not a separate need to put that in the restrictive declaration, as you have to show that to the Department of Environmental Protection in order to get your sewer connection. So
right. I took some notes this morning, but you talk about, the proposed project would support water quality by incorporating stormwater management systems into the design to meet New York City requirements, and you use as examples water efficient fixtures and a likely use of roof fixtures. Likely use, where are they? What kind of green roofs do you have? That level of, not trying to be difficult, just edifying community as to what they're getting in terms of innovation and critically needed green infrastructure in this neighborhood, in a flood zone. What is exactly going to be happening here? So I don't know, that's kind of where I'm going. Like with the green roofs, for example, and the open space that you refer to also, that's critical for this community. Where exactly is that? Let's just ask that. Open space, you talk about open space. You talk about the greening of some of the urban area. Now you're looking to have ownership or, proprietorship over a great deal of the streets. You have a chance here to, what are you doing? Are these areas going to be more permeable? What exactly is being done on the streets, on the building, on the sidewalks, to confirm that this in fact is all going to be better than it is now in terms of being more resilient and more environmentally conscientious?
Just to, on the street, there is no increase in ownership on the street. They're being included in the large-scale plan.
That's what it is.
And the large-scale plan itself is only memorializing the existing conditions. So there's no increase in ownership interest whatsoever by Howard Hughes Corporation there.
You'll be managing it though in some way, there's some sort of
We manage
leasing.
it.
They're all,
Right.
are already.
We're not changing their management.
All the more reason that you can make commitments regarding these issues.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, will there be more I think there's even reference to it, somewhere here under the open space, that there would be some amount of, yes, natural resources. You put under that, in the natural resources, yes, through redeveloping brownfields, that of course, but where are you planting the street trees that are mentioned, and this creation of more vegetation, you creating open space, capturing water runoff. I mean, it all sounds good, but where is it, and how are we as a community really going to be assured for these things to be in the plan? I don't know. Is that really unclear in any way? But, like, where's the specific, the open space issues and the green?
You know, there are requirements to plant street trees along the perimeter of the site, and so some of those are shown on the site plan in the land use application.
Yeah. And what about the green roof?
There are no commitments to construct green roofs. There's landscape roof areas. It's not a stormwater detention type of green roof that one might think of.
And why not?
In order to, here we're committed, of course, to meet the standards that are required for stormwater detention on the site. And so the absolute performance, the amount of flow that will go into the system, that they can achieve. They'll know that they can achieve. The mechanical measures behind that and how they get there, that is not all things possible.
But just in terms of like just basic understanding that green roofs are generally considered a good, mitigation to climate concerns, right? Why isn't this project, which is so seminal in many ways, taking that on as a part of sort of mandate? I mean, I don't know.
Well, there are a lot of different factors, and it's something we're looking at. It was identified as a potential measure, but it's being looked at in the
We're trying to figure
context
out
of the whole
mechanical equipment. I mean, it's not as simple as saying the roof is going to be green. We're trying to figure out how much the roof is left when we're done with all the mechanical equipment up there. We have the height restriction. We're trying to figure out what's left, and that's the purpose of, we would like to see we would love to see the project have a green roof. We're just trying to figure out what's left there. Does it make sense at that point with what's left to make it, or is there other places that are better to spend your money as far as making it, as you'd say, forefront as possible. That's what we're working on.
Well, and another one that came to mind that we talked about, I guess you're just taking notes on all our concerns, so these are things we really would want to see. I think we've all talked about it for a long time. And the other one that really is, I don't know, for me personally, it just doesn't make a lot of sense because I don't really drive that much, but the garage, this huge space underneath the building that, I know a couple of years ago we talked about the idea of that being a storm water retention area, Laura Starr brought that up, and it was a really, really great point. Why does it have to be for cars? And what exactly are we saying by taking over this huge amount of space that's probably costing you a pretty penny for cars? Isn't there something else you could be using that for? I don't know, was there any alternative thinking on that space? And do we really have to have parking in this building? And it's all private parking, right? As I understand, this is just for the people who own or rent or go to work there or something.
It's primarily for the residential building, and then for the commercial component, a small percentage, and if there are any spaces left, they may be available for the public.
And I just don't see how that really confirms your support of making this more environmentally conscientious, right? Like, this is just, cars and parking, it's just not, the amount of money that it would, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, I have a million notes here, and they're completely out of order, and I'm sorry, I seem to have taken over the line of questioning, but I have. You do state here that you don't adversely affect zoning policy or regulation or the social policies. And, I guess the jury's out on that, but, some things you state are very specific. You state that the goal of Vision Zero, being met here, encouraging pedestrian-friendly environments that include in-the-streetscape improvements. That's what I'm referring to. Like it states it, but we want to see it. And you state specifically the conversion of Peck Slip between Pearl and Water to a play street. Sounds grand. Is that part of the restrictive declaration? Are we getting that?
We can't do that. We proposed it, but we can't do it. I mean, that's not our decision to make, but we have proposed it as part of the deal.
Okay.
So I don't know how we can.
And also, we did, as part of the land use presentation, there was a site plan with some proposed landscape improvements and streetscape improvements. So we have already presented that, and those plans will continue to be detailed and evolved as we go forward through the year.
Well, I'll take a break here. Go ahead,
Well,
Jeff.
I wanted to follow up on a construction mitigation measure that I had forgotten about, that we experienced the need for on the west side, and that is protection for when accidents happen out the non-sealed windows or when the windows are being installed. We had a number of accidents at the Goldman Sachs building, which is right next to the ball fields. And of course, you can read about them in the newspapers. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They happen from time to time in Manhattan. And with the play street right next door where the kids are playing outside, you know, I think it's important to have mitigation measures to prevent hammers from falling out the windows, you know, the open windows that aren't sealed, window panes as they're being installed. I mean, they're going to fall. I mean, it just happens. You know, some buildings in some cities are basically enclosed in netting to prevent those kinds of accidents. And, you know, I know you saw sidewalk sheds don't do a great deal of good when you've got essentially a playground right outside the street. So I'd like to hear your reactions to the mitigation that you could do to prevent those kinds of accidents, especially in a play area.
Well, first of all, I'll say we're going to be, you know, working very carefully with DOB, and the project, notwithstanding the EIS requirements, you know, we'll have a very robust health and safety plan to be able to be permitted and be constructed. But in terms of, you know, getting into the nitty-gritty of the details of some of those types of things, you know, these are construction coordination and planning. We're not going away just after this meeting. I mean, that's something we will be continuing to have a dialogue with the community about to assure schools, the residents, workers, whoever's, you know, in the vicinity of the site, that there is a safe environment and that we're preventing any issues from happening, you know, including, you know, falling windows and other, you know, unanticipated.
Have you considered a protection plan, and will that protection plan put scaffolding and protective netting along the Peck Slip School, along the buildings, on the east side of Water Street, for example? Do you anticipate all of that protection going up for 3 years?
You know, we should, these are the kind of detailed questions, and these are very valid, and we want to, you know, certainly return when we have a more fully fleshed out logistics plan, but that's something that we're going to be working on as we're, you know, continuing to design the building as I've described. But
Definitely considered it over the Peck Slip School area. Just requires more than us just saying we want to. We have to figure it out. We have to work with the city agencies. We have to understand what to do. We have to work with the school. We have to talk to Maggie. So those are the kind of.
Sure, the DOE will be very happy to hear that. Thank you.
Okay. We've got about 10 people, I think, outside of the room, and Richard Foreman.
Yeah, I'd like to stay with what Alice was talking about before, about the environment, the energy efficiency and environmental innovation of the building. As I was hearing what you're saying, that a lot of these issues are going to be worked out in the design, and what can be done in the design will determine the level of efficiency and environmental innovation you achieve. I think it has to go the other way around, which is I'd like to understand what commitments you want to make in terms of what kind of building this is going to be, solar efficiency, energy efficiency, the other things that Alice is talking about, and that should just determine the design itself instead of the other way around. So it's not clear from the statements what you're going to achieve in terms of environmental, let's just call it innovation here, for lack of a better word, and what the design objective is going to be around those issues.
Well, what we've said is that we will achieve a minimum, when you're looking at the certification standards, that we would achieve a minimum of LEED Silver. We're considering higher levels, and there are also other certification programs that we're looking at as well. And, you know, we also described, you know, looking at all electric for portions of the building, for other portions of the building that may not initially be all electric, being able to be retrofitted in the future. We're also subject, you know, to local law 97. So we're looking at all these things, and we do have goals, and we are committed to a very sustainable, forward-looking building. But there is some more of an iterative process that goes on, and you know, we don't want to be arbitrary about goals for a building that it's a complicated mixed-use building, and it's going to be a very good neighbor ultimately. But we want to make sure that, you know, we design it in a very thoughtful way, and it works, you know, on a number of levels.
Anybody else on the committee? Okay, Diana, do we have?
Yes, there's 10 people on the list. I'm going to go to Jonathan Bulwer first, then Ernest Tollerson, and then Catherine McFay-Hughes. Jonathan, are you on?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, welcome.
Great. Thank you. I don't seem to be able to engage video here, so I will just go with audio. So good evening. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Chair Blank, members of the Environmental Protection Committee, neighbors, friends. My name is Jonathan Bulwer. As many of you know, I'm president of the South Street Seaport Museum, but I'm also a resident. I live in the South Street Seaport Historic District with my family. My wife and I are raising our child here. The Seaport Museum, of course, is supportive of the application before you tonight, but I appear tonight in my capacity as a resident of Lower Manhattan and the Seaport specifically. As a resident and as a longtime lover of the Seaport and its museum, since I was a kid, really, since the 70s, I guess, I am also supportive of the project before your committee. To be clear, though, in my role as a resident, there are reasonable questions being raised in the context of this proposal. And many of you are asking good questions tonight. All of Lower Manhattan and the water's edge were commercial port areas. They were manufacturing centers when New York was dominating in that way. All manner of commercial operations long before any of the environmental rules that we're familiar with existed. So as Ms. Dodge points out, there are contaminants, and these, in my view, can be remediated. They should be remediated, and they should be remediated responsibly and promptly. Many of us were here, and I know some of you were, as I was during Sandy, when we saw firsthand how the East River permeated the soils of the island. And knowing that the next such event will do the same, I would like to see these soils remediated so that my family and my friends and my neighbors will be safe from those toxins. And of course, as has been discussed tonight, construction has impacts, often significant ones. But we live in New York, and our city has a framework for construction to be conducted responsibly. The management of construction, noise, dust, safety, all highly relevant. These are important questions to be asking, and the answers are really important. Getting the details right will matter. And I look forward to the complete development of the framework that will ensure that this project is conducted responsibly and safely for the residents and neighbors of the district. As a person who cares very much about the future of the South Street Seaport and its cultural beating heart, the museum, I'm eager to see the positive outcomes that will come from cleanup and the numerous other benefits that this larger project will produce, including, as you know, a future for the museum. So on that, I will, this has been a long meeting, and I'll thank you for your time, and thank you for offering me some of yours and for the opportunity to speak before you this evening.
Can I ask Jonathan a question? Jonathan, stay with us. Grace Lee is here and like to ask you a question.
Hi, Jonathan. I was just curious, how old is your child, and where does your child attend school?
My child is 15 and attends Millennium High School downtown.
Did they ever attend Texas?
Nope.
Okay.
I don't think it was those questions. Okay, sure. Thanks.
Sure, yeah.
I'm going next to Bob Schneck, who's a member of this committee. Bob?
Okay, am I on? I just wanted I just wanted to comment.
We can hear you,
I just
Bob.
wanted to comment that I listened to the person comment on local law 97, and I've started to do a fair amount of work on local law 97. Over time, I've been an advocate of passive house, but I think local law 97 is an important place for any building in the city to lead, and I think it's a place where the city itself needs to educate itself and kind of develop methodologies for how these buildings are built. So this is a real opportunity for everyone to work together, particularly Howard Hughes and the wonderful design, very deep design teams it has, to kind of determine how a building can meet all of the requirements of local law 97. And in particular, I would encourage that passive house be explored for the methodology of that. And I think, so my question is, I think that the answer that I heard on local law 97 was, oh, we'll just get that right. I think that a commitment to being a leader in how that's achieved is really important at this point.
Bob, do you have a question here, or are you just commenting?
My question is, what, besides just mentioning that local law 97 is important, what kind of commitment is being made in this project to kind of get that right? And to be a leader in how that's achieved for the city.
Yeah, I mean, we're not making a specific commitment at this
Speak
point.
up.
We're not making a specific commitment at this point, Bob, but we are. It is a an important initiative of the city, and we're going to be, as we work on these various other aspects of the design, we certainly will be looking to meet as many of the objectives as we can under that local law, and I think, as you know, there are penalties if you don't meet those, and we certainly would prefer to not be penalized, and at the same time have a very environmentally sustainable and resilient building.
Thank you.
All right. Next is Ernest Tollerson, and then Catherine McVeigh. Ernest?
Ernest
yes, can you hear
Tollerson?
me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, terrific. So my name is Ernest Tollerson. I'm on the board of the South Street Seaport Museum, and I've lived in Lower Manhattan for 40 years. And my wife and I raised 2 kids here in a part of the city that, as you know, was originally New Amsterdam. I want to, first of all, sort of second Jonathan Boulware's comments about the sort of the need for a comprehensive remediation plan and the execution of that plan. And, I look forward to the efforts of this committee to monitor and ride herd over all elements of it. But my reason, obviously, for testifying tonight is that your committee, as well as other committees of Community Board 1, sort of understand how the South Street Seaport Museum sees this situation. So obviously, as a trustee, we're eager to rebuild museum sources of recurring operating revenue, which gives the museum an overriding interest in the community benefits fund that would be created if and when 250 Water Street is ever developed. Revenue from commercial activity within the South Street Seaport Historic District, and revenue, frankly, from any new development within the historic district should always provide financial support for the museum. And it's important for me as a trustee of the museum to kind of remind you of that sort of operating principle, which frankly over the decades has been often ignored. So should a viable development proposal emerge from the ULEP process, the South Street Seaport Museum and affordable housing should be the primary beneficiaries of the pool of funds earmarked for community benefits. As a long-term resident of Lower Manhattan, I firmly believe that a community benefits fund should also finance the creation of more space for active recreation, think Battery Park City, the implementation of a Barcelona-inspired approach to shared streets, reimagine public spaces, better ways of handling garbage, and other elements of our new Amsterdam streetscape. You might wonder why I underscore this community benefits package before a committee focused on environmental issues. But I think rethinking and rationalizing the use of public space south of Chambers Street, east of Broadway, is essential if we want to make the South Street Seaport Museum's existing campus and ships visible and legible. Embracing the ideas outlined in Make Way for Lower Manhattan, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, would be a good start. In short, the livability of our world south of Chambers and east of Broadway could be enhanced and transformed by using the Community Benefits Fund to prioritize two smart and worthy investments, making the South Street Seaport Museum a stronger cultural institution and building affordable housing in a neighborhood that sorely needs it. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to remind everyone it's not a public hearing tonight. We're not testifying. We're just really trying to get information and ask questions about the environmental impact statement. So just a small reminder. Thank you. Who do we have next?
Next is Catherine Hughes, and after that will be Neil Flaherty. Catherine?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Good evening. My name is Catherine McVeigh Hughes, and I'm a proud board member of the South Street Seaport Museum. I'd like to second what both Jonathan and Ernest have said. Before I get to my prepared remarks, I just wanted to follow up because I've worked with you over the decades on rebuilding our neighborhood since 9/11. So I think Paul Goldstein was referring to the auger instead of a pile driver. And best practices were used to minimize vibration at the building of the Fulton Street Transit Center next to the historic Corbin building and the subway lines. Two, I believe Jeff Galloway was referring to the process of cocooning to make sure that nothing falls off during the construction process. Three, traffic changes. I think the way that having seen this information for the first time tonight, there will be changes in the traffic if one, congestion pricing goes through as it is anticipated in some form or another. And for those who haven't been paying attention to the resiliency plan from the city of the Fide Seaport area, where the ramp, the FDR ramp south of Brooklyn Bridge will come down. So both of those will probably also change the traffic pattern on Pearl Street. So we can't just look at the past, we have to look forward. Item 4 is just the extreme weather event. I just want to urge caution as we approach the 9-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, that we don't have an incident of some extreme weather event during the construction process. Okay, so my prepared statement is the mission of the South Street Seaport Museum is to distort this neighborhood, and we would never support a project that would inflict environmental harm or pose any kind of threat to the community at large. Quite the opposite. The sustainability of our community is at the very crux of our support. We depend on visitors to the district for our own survival. Health and resiliency are key elements to long-term sustainability for preservation, education, culture, and tourism. Few institutions in the world understand environmental impacts in the way that the South Street Seaport Museum does. Nearly 10 years ago, when I was chair of Manhattan Community Board 1, Superstorm Sandy inflicted devastating damage to Lower Manhattan, including the Seaport District and the museum. It forced the museum's exhibition spaces to close indefinitely and sent the museum into a financial hole, and the COVID pandemic has compounded that. Because of this, we are particularly sensitive to how the environment impacts this community. We want the best possible outcomes for our friends and neighbors. We want to see a community that thrives. I think that HHC has become a very good neighbor over the past several years, moving and rebuilding the tin building on newly rebuilt piles and helping our neighborhood prepare for climate change. All New Yorkers know that construction does create unavoidable inconvenience, but it's worth it in the long run for a vibrant community with the South Street Seaport Museum, a cultural icon at its heart, protecting and preserving the surrounding neighborhood for future generations. The South Street Seaport Museum proudly supports this plan and looks forward to continuing our stewardship of the historic district for years to come. Thank you very much for all your hard work as community volunteers.
Thanks, Catherine. Anybody else?
Yep, next is Neil Flaherty, and then will be Frederick Baker. Neil, are you on?
Yes, I am. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. My name is Neil Flaherty, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of this plan that will enhance the district and the long-term health of our community. I've been part of this community since I began working in the financial district in 1967 and started volunteering at the Seaport Museum in 1981. The museum has been in the forefront of educating the public about the need to protect our environment, both on the waters of New York as well as the land. The effects of climate change and the danger it poses to our community are no more evident than the catastrophic results of Superstorm Sandy. Its effects on the museum and our community are still being felt today. Construction projects are never convenient, but in a city like New York, which is always growing and reinventing itself, it's a way of life. This project will not have any long-term negative environmental effect on the community from the construction. The project is not a detriment to the district. Instead, it will provide a great boost both economically and environmentally. The existing parking lot site, which contains numerous industrial toxins and hazardous materials, including mercury, benzene, lead, and barium, will be remediated. This project will provide the financial stability that the museum needs and deserves. This project will allow the museum to continue its mission of educating the public and the stewardship of the seaport environment. I ask you to support it and the South Street Seaport Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Next is Frederick Baker, and then will be Susan Murray. Frederick?
Yes, hi there. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So I also, like Neil, I have been volunteering at the South Street Seaport Museum for nearly 10 years. So not quite the length that Neil has, but a solid amount of time. I've been a sailor all my life. And really one of the things that always struck me about the historic Seaport District is the fact that there are historic ships. Without the museum's ships, there is no historic district. The historic district, the Seaport District, is predicated on there being a seaport. So without some method in place to protect and develop the museum, both as an institution as well as against future environmental disasters, there is no Seaport District. So I'm fully in favor of all the questions. Professionally, I work training and developing people to act as environmental remediation technicians. And so I work with many of these companies across the city. I actually don't currently work with Langen, but would be more than happy to do so for my participants. Regardless, the Seaport District needs the kind of capabilities to withstand future disasters. Having this project go up helps make all that possible.
Thank
That's
you,
all
Mr.
I
Baker.
have.
Thank you. I'm going to interrupt people. Okay, I want to make it clear that it's going on to, after 9 o'clock, and I'm sorry that this committee will not entertain any more comments that are not specific and helpful to the applicants for reviewing the draft environmental impact statement on the site at 250 Water Street. Any other comments are not welcome at this point in the evening. I ask for your apology in advance for being a little draconian here on that point, but it is late, and we really want to get information to the applicant that's going to be helpful, and that would be helpful, which is to speak specifically about questions, comments, concerns on the environmental impact statement. Thank you. Okay, anybody else on that topic and that topic only?
All right, next is Susan Murray, and after that will be Kim Busey. Susan, are you
Yes,
there?
good evening. My name is Susan Murray. I've been a volunteer at South Street Seaport Museum since the early 1980s. As such,
You have
I'm a
comments on the
stakeholder.
environmental impact, correct?
Correct. I hope so.
Great. Good, thank you.
I've been a volunteer since the early 1980s, and so I am a stakeholder and devoted advocate for the historic district. That is why I am speaking in support of the 250 Water Street plan. It will not only benefit the community socially and economically, it will improve the district environmentally. As you know, the remedial investigation of the site found a long list of toxic substances, and that really impressed me. Just a few of them being pesticides, PCBs, mercury, volatile organic compounds, and benzene. The developer for the 250 Water Street project is a private entity which is ready to invest millions of dollars to clean up this brownfield site. The appropriate health and safety measures will be employed during both the remedial process and the building construction in order to protect the health and safety of on-site workers and community members. I love the historic district, but sadly, part of its history, beginning in the mid-1800s, includes factories and other commercial ventures that damage the environment. The 250 Water Street project is your opportunity to finally clean up this site, and I strongly urge your committee to support it. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other comments on the environmental impact statement as it's been presented this evening from the public or from the committee members or the other community board members?
All right, next is Kim Busey, and then will be Tom. Kim?
Hi, thank you for speaking. I wanted to just briefly mention, I'm a long-term resident and I'm speaking in that regard. And I really, agree with all that has been said. And I wanted to tell you that I appreciate all the care that you are doing, the community board is doing. And I feel very confident by listening to your testimony. I also feel very confident in what has been HHC's commitment to our community. All I wanted to really talk about is timing, because we're living through another one of those, times in our life where we have to balance and expedite things and based on priorities. And so I just really, please, I'm asking both parties to really work hard to expedite this and work together to make this development possible as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Tom?
Hold on. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Tom.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Set the for everyone 1 minute. Okay.
My video is disabled, so I'll just speak. Anyway, it's lovely to hear everyone's voices, and I want to say that I agree very much. I really enjoyed Jonathan's comments and Catherine's, and I wanted to say that I'm hopeful that that Howard Hughes can maybe get ahead of us as a community a little bit with maybe just, even if you can't commit to something, maybe you can just tell us some of the ideas you're considering and going to be exploring in your design phase, like fusion destruction of garbage, or like some of the really cool fun stuff we've, as a community board and on the environmental protection committee, have heard about and have been very excited about, and water recapture and all the different technologies that you already know about, that you've been looking at, and that I know that you're trying to figure out how to do. Maybe you can just give us a little hit list of desires with all the caveats you need, so that the community can really get sink their teeth into it and understand, and then maybe provide some expertise or some good back and forth and community input. And green space, of course, is vital to all of us. And I'm speaking right now not as an interested business party and with in support of the museum. although I do, and I'll disclose that, but also as a 25, maybe 30-year resident of downtown with 3 young children who have attended, 2 have attended PEC and 1 is in pre-K. So.
Thanks, Tom. Do you want to respond to that, in terms of the list of items that you're?
I think it's not
Not
the
right.
best time to do that, to
No,
go through a list, but I think that, we certainly, as I've said before, we'll be, as we go through the process, we'll be coming back with more information, and we can provide information beyond tonight, which was focused on the EIS. But with our, when we have not only ourselves, but our real experts in sustainability who, haven't been engaged on the project and are working hard on it, but they're not with us tonight.
Can you give us a sense of when that might happen?
I think we should come back and discuss with the community board the various comments and issues that have been raised tonight.
Would this be after?
That being one of them, the construction, and figure out the appropriate time to come back, during this, next phase of the ULURP, which extends through the end of the year. We also have the City Planning Commission hearing coming up. So I can't say specifically when, but I think it would be some point between.
Yeah, is it before the City Planning Commission hearing or after, I guess?
Let's find out.
All right, well, that's great. So Tom.
The only thing I wanted to say about the
Yeah.
list is that's what we tried to do a little bit today. Obviously, we're reaching for goals. We put silver there. And the last thing I wanted to say, you promised us X and deliver Y. So our goal, here is to really under-promise and over-deliver. But, that's why we dial some things back to make sure, because again, we are still designing and it's we're moving quickly to make sure that we achieve as much as we can.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, who else?
All right, next is Maggie Flanagan, and after that will be Chris Berg.
Remember, on the EIS only and 1 minute and a half.
Certainly. I'm Maggie Flanagan, an environmental educator on New York Harbor and a member of the volunteer crew at South Street Seaport Museum also for 2 decades on my part. And it's the Seaport, that immersive heritage experience and hands-on outdoor stuff that has long inspired me to be an urban steward. Like you all, we all know now it will take even more effort to prepare for climate change, and preserving our urban environment is even an additional difficult challenge on top of that. And I believe this project is proceeding in that direction thoughtfully and carefully with its suggested mitigations, which are strengthened by the public review dialogue we're having now. And as others said, that there are long-term benefits that can outweigh the temporary challenges. So it's very welcome to hear about these resilient and green buildings, and also to hear about this committee's interest in more specifics about that. And I support everyone else's comments on the wider benefits that this project enables the preservation of the heritage of the district through the Seaport Museum, and its really unique natural connections that are so inspiring. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, Chris Berg, and then will be Megan Malvern. Chris? Chris Berg, are you with us? Okay, let's move on to Megan Malvern.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I just wanted to start with, I believe it's wholly unfair to have anyone talk in support of this plan at this meeting. Alice, thank you very much for pointing out that this is the point when we were supposed to be listening and learning and asking questions about what is put before us. And then we were meant to opine and think about and decide if this is the right way forward. There are hundreds of families who are wholly suspect of the broad-based talking points that are outlined in this DEIS. And unlike our friends at the South Street Seaport Museum, Jonathan, Ernest, Catherine, Neil, and Tom, I have read the DEIS. In fact, I've studied it, I've thought about it for amounts of time that are almost unchartable. And I have questions about what I actually read about the DEIS. One of the things that I think is incredible for us to understand is that the cement park called Peck Slip Park gets more consideration in this DEIS than the public school of Peck Slip or the Smith houses, which are really very close to the whole project. The gardens, the playgrounds, the open air of any of those projects have no weight inside the DEIS. Please understand that and listen to what I just said. The cement park at Peck Slip has more consideration because it's considered a public park and has public access, as opposed to the families who send their kids and are going to be locked inside that school from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m., perhaps 6 p.m., 5 days a week. We have less to say and we are less important in the DEIS than a cement parking lot down the street that anyone can choose to leave at any time. The DEIS is incredibly flawed, and it does exactly what it's meant to do. It handcuffs a community into thinking that what is being put before you is the most important and the most reasonable. There is nothing reasonable about what's being put before this community, and that anyone is talking about the benefit to the South Street Seaport Museum over the health and education of hundreds of children that go to Peck Slip and they don't get to be considered in this is vile. So I would like to understand how this DEIS is going to address the concerns and the genuine fear that families have who send their kids to Peck Slip, who live in the Smith houses or who live at Southbridge or across the street. Because those are considered sort of private residences, we don't matter. And those are the people who actually live there.
Okay, thanks, Megan. That's a pretty powerful point. Does anybody from your team want to respond to how that will be addressed?
So there are a number of ways the textbook school is considered,
Speak up.
schools in general are considered in the EIS. First off, schools are considered as to whether they would become overcrowded by the additional residents and the students. Secondly, there are considerations about noise, both in terms of whether additional traffic would cause noise that would impact the school, whether construction noise, as we said tonight, would impact the school, and then also air quality issues. So it's considered a sensitive receptor for all of these purposes, and that location is looked at in technical areas and chapters throughout the EIS.
Okay. Have we hit the end here? Thank you.
I'm going to try Chris again because he messaged that he's going to try another mic, and then will be Denny Salas and then Andy, and that's the end of my list.
Okay.
Chris, are you with us now?
Thanks for patience.
Chris, I don't think it's working. Oh, I see you're muting on and off. I'm going to invite you in the chat to submit some written comments. So we'll go to Denny Salas and then Andy.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First, thank you for allowing me to have some time, and I'll be very brief considering it is very late. But I am supportive of this project, but my question is really towards the environmental impact study by Howard Hughes. And has there been any consideration to do a potential kind of carbon footprint study of any potential new residents that currently travel into the area for work, but no longer would need to if they actually be provided with housing options that they currently will not be able to get down there in the seaport?
Well, that's right.
I guess I would add to that question, has any carbon analysis been done also for the amount of?
Well, there is, I mean, there's
the construction and the demolition and all of that?
Yeah, there is an analysis of GHG emissions in the EIS. I don't know that it goes to the degree that the caller was speaking about. I wasn't entirely clear about commuting or.
You're saying because people aren't gonna have to commute, they're gonna be living there, is there an impact? I think what you're saying is they're not having.
Like a live-work type.
People who live closer, I guess, is what I understood.
It's something you can do.
I mean, I think.
I don't think it's been addressed in the specific way he asked the question.
Yes, it's not.
Okay.
Yeah, I just know in general, there are studies that have proven that the carbon footprint of an individual that does not need to travel as much, obviously, provides an environmental benefit in general for the community and for the area itself. But I'm not sure if Howard Hughes has been able to incorporate, you know, a percentage of potential residents in the building that will somehow live in the seaport rather than travel from an outside area.
I don't think it's been quantified. I don't think it's been quantified, but I think it's
Tough thing to quantify, and you have to balance that with all the people owning cars, the 108 cars that they'll be driving. I think that's tricky, not to mention the amount of carbon in the construction of that building and the demolition.
Look, it's building housing and jobs near mass transit, even if you have some cars in the garage, is still, you know, responsible development. And it's, you know, there's a 400 space parking lot there now, so.
Well, okay. All right, what, anybody?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy, you're the last on our list.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm only talking because I've heard this parade of people from Howard Hughes talking about how wonderful this project is going to be. And it is a sham of a rush to push this through. And I thank you, Environmental Protection Committee, for doing what you need to do to turn this down, because this is a terrible thing that will be forced upon this community. It is a flood zone. It is an environmental disaster to put up a 300-foot building there. And it will kill the seaport. And those people who are indebted to Howard Hughes, yeah, they're for it. But the community is against it, and please represent us. Thank you.
Well, that's a happy note, Tom. Okay, well, thank you so much. I just wanted to add, I don't know if anybody else, but just quickly, I think it's critical here, just going forward, that, you know, the open space issue is really critical, and it's been reduced here, and whatever can be done to really underline what is being done in this project for the creation, the greening, the amelioration, whatever you want to call it, of open space. And, you know, I know we discussed at one point with the zoning proposal flood resiliency, there was some amount of FAR that would be a gain potentially in this project for you all. Is there any room for any other public open space in that project, on a roof, on the ground floor, on a sidewalk, on a street, anywhere? It would be something that I think this community board has often spoke about, that we just never seem to get fully addressed. Now's the time in the open space on the EIS. Is there something there that can be added into the, you know, design part that you're working on now? And specifically, we'd love to know what that FAR addition is for the zoning proposal flood resiliency.
We're not taking advantage of this.
I thought you were not sure you were. Now you're not for sure?
No, we described at the last meeting about how it really wasn't usable, given the constraints of the envelope.
Yeah.
It's not useful.
The deduction was not going to produce benefits to the project overall.
So there won't be any deductions.
You know, as a technical matter, the zoning floor area could be less. We're not building more space.
Okay. This will be another list. It definitely doesn't, but I don't want to belabor a long evening. I just had one other point for me personally. I was very, very fascinated by the intensive archaeological documentary study, which I'm happy to say was the last document in that packet. Can you just describe, or I don't know who all could, so this site potentially has tremendous archaeological goodies, right? Potentially. You could find a slave ship, who knows? How is that brownfield work going to work in tandem with the archaeologists? And can you just, I know you touched on it in the last meeting, you know, how the archaeology of the site will be dealt with, you know, the findings. And if you found something, what happens?
Well, a work plan would have to be developed. It is a little bit tricky because of the hazardous materials.
Can you pull that down?
Yeah, sorry. It is a little bit tricky because of the hazardous materials conditions on the site. But essentially, you know, a registered archaeologist would be on site. They also have OSHA training for hazardous materials certification to be present while work is being undertaken, so that they can monitor to see while things are being dug up if there's anything of archaeological interest. If necessary, based on, you know, the studies that have been done or will be done.
But did the LTC, they stated that they wanted, I didn't understand what this meant, the site of 250 Water Street should be, and I quote from their letter to you, archaeologically tested rather than just monitored if possible.
Yes, correct.
What
And
is,
in fact, we provided a written response, I think, to the other committee we're happy to share with you. That sort of whittles down the essence of the approach that would be taken for archaeological concerns.
right, I saw that, I think that's your response, right?
You know, it's sort of phased so that investigation is done to see if there's any potential for anything. Testing can be done to, if there's anything there worthwhile looking at, to see if there's actually anything in the ground. And then when work takes place, it's necessary to monitor as construction's happening, like we did with the, World Trade Center and lo and behold, I suppose.
Right, so that's sort of, they proposed project will require the installation of a bathtub through the installation of a slurry roll for copper dam. Is that part of the plan?
I don't know that that's
It's
part
in
of the
this.
plan. I believe that the idea was that dewatering would take place, prior to any sort of investigative testing, probing.
Well, I guess you can just assume you're on it, whatever you, okay. But that seems like a very critical and potentially fabulous part of anything that's dug up there, but, okay, well, that's just, yeah. Anybody else, last comments or thoughts? So it sounds like we'll be meeting again, you're gonna let us know when.
One thing I didn't do is I wanted to thank John, Cap. I wanted to thank the Deputy Borough President for coordinating with Langen, with Langen and with,
Laura Dodge,
because there was a lot of back and forth, and without him, without Matthew, we would not have gotten it done, and he took it under his arm and really led it on both sides, and I know it wasn't easy, a lot of back and forth, but I want to thank him on behalf of the community and on behalf of Howard Hughes for taking a keen interest in it and getting it done for all of us, so.
and
thank you.
I just want to warn you, Saul said I took it under my arm. It's very sweaty under my arm.
Well, we'll look forward to that meeting that's coming up that we just talked about earlier.
Yes.
Okay.
Alice, whenever you need us to help, sorry, Madam Chair, whenever you need us to help.
Well, thanks, everybody. It's nice to see everyone in person, and more to come, and good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Good night.
Thank you.